In 6 days, Derek Vale would run out of water. His sister was 11 years old. She had been coughing for 3 weeks straight and wouldn't make it through the cold season without medicine. Derek counted his supply every morning. 4 full flasks in the cellar, one partially empty one on the kitchen table. 3 sips a day for 2 people. That's 6 days. He checked the count 3 times. The count never changed. The collapse happened 11 months ago. No one knew exactly what had fallen to the ground. The sky turned the color of wet ash. The sun turned into a white spot behind a gray veil. The greenery stopped growing in the 3rd month. The livestock died off by the 5th month. Famine set in by the 7th and never left. Money was the first to die. Paper doesn't feed you. Metal doesn't feed you. Weapons lost their value the fastest. There were so many bullets left in the country that you could have paved roads with them. There was nothing left to shoot at. By the 9th month, people had already started killing each other over a can of corn. By the 11th month, the can had become the currency of the entire eastern route. 1 can of corned beef went for 4 liters of clean water. 5 cans bought a day's worth of protection from any gunman. A good rifle, along with ammunition, cost 20 cans. No one counted in money anymore. Everyone counted in cans. Derek Vale had worked for 12 years as a stock clerk at the Talbot distribution warehouse. He kept track of 8,000 inventory items. He knew the shelf numbers by heart. He knew how many crates would fit in the back of a truck and how many people were needed to unload them. That skill was useless in the new world. Warehouses no longer existed. There were pits of rot and basements full of rats. The only thing left from his old job was the habit of counting. Derek counted everything. Steps to the water pump, liters in the crawl space, days until the end. Talbot stood in a low-lying area by the dried-up river. Of the 40,000 residents, about 200 remained. The rest had left, died, or become something in between. Derek's house was the last one in a row by the embankment. Inside, it smelled of smoke and dampness. Tessa was lying on a mattress against the wall, wrapped in 3 blankets. She was coughing quietly. She'd learned to cough quietly back in the summer. A loud cough in Talbot drew attention. Attention in Talbot came at a high price. Derek sat down beside her and placed his hand on her forehead. Her forehead was hot. He told his sister he was going to the market and would be back with water. She replied that he'd said the same thing yesterday. He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. He took his father's watch from the bottom of the box. Mechanical, steel case, the only valuable thing in the house. He took his work jacket off the hook and slung it over his shoulder. The jacket was warm. Winter was coming down from the north. He took it anyway. The market was set up by the water pump on 8 pillars square. Billboards used to stand here. Now, sacks of lime and signs with exchange rates hung from the pillars. The rates were written in chalk. The chalk was wiped off twice a day. In the morning, 1 can cost 4 liters. By evening, 3. People stood in 2 lines, one for water, one for the exchange counter. The line for water was 4 times longer. It smelled of smoke and unwashed bodies. The children didn't run around. They stood next to the adults and stared at the ground. Irma Guest ran the exchange table. She was about 50. She had a leather-bound notebook and a pencil on a string. She kept track of all of Talbot's transactions and took 1 can out of every 10 for her trouble. No one liked her. Everyone just put up with her. Without her notebook, no one could remember who owed whom. Derek placed the watch on the table. Irma picked it up with 2 fingers and held it up to the light. She said it was metal. She said you don't chew metal. She said that before the collapse, you could buy a month of life with something like that, but now you couldn't even buy a single meal. Derek replied that the watch was still running. He said the mechanical movement didn't require batteries, and would keep running long after all the others had died. Irma smirked and jotted something down in her notebook. She offered him half a liter of water. Derek didn't take his hand off the table. He added his jacket. Irma felt the lining. She looked up and asked if he knew how much it would cost tonight. He knew. He left the jacket on the table. The haggling went on for 9 minutes. Derek never raised his voice once. He spoke in numbers. He stated the jacket's weight and the thickness of the lining. He gave the watch's exact daily rate of accuracy. Irma listened and frowned. In the end, she handed over a can of stewed meat and 1.5 liters of water in a cloudy bottle. She said she was doing it out of respect for his father. She was lying. She was doing it because the numbers worked out in her favor. Derek nodded and tucked the can under his shirt. He took 6 steps back from the table. Cordo was standing further away. Cordo was a bouncer for the men with hooks on their sleeves. He was a head taller than Derek and weighed twice as much. He ate every day. You could tell by the look on his face. He blocked the way and held out his hand. He said they charged a tithe for passing through the square. Derek replied that the tithe was collected from merchants. Cordo replied that they collected it from anyone who had the means to pay. He took the water bottle. He unscrewed the cap and poured half of it onto the ground right in front of Derek. The ground soaked up the water in 2 seconds. The people in line looked away. No one said a word. Cordo handed back the bottle with the remaining water and patted Derek on the shoulder. He said Derek had gotten off easy. Derek looked at the wet spot. He squeezed the neck of the bottle so hard the plastic crunched. He didn't look up. He kept walking. He turned into an alley between 2 burned-out houses. He leaned his back against the wall and pulled out a can. The metal was cold. A blue label and the date were printed on the side. He was holding 4 liters of water at the morning rate. He was holding 2 days of his sister's life in his hands. And then something clicked in his head, not in his ears, right in his head. The sound was short and dry, like the lock on the filing cabinet drawer. A pale line appeared before his eyes. First honest transaction registered. Registry open. 3 empty slots. Derek froze. He thought it was hunger. Hunger made people do far worse things. He blinked. The line didn't disappear. He picked up the can. The line changed. Add item to the registry. He thought for 8 seconds. Then he mentally agreed. The can grew heavier. It warmed up under his fingers. Half a minute later, a new message appeared before his eyes. Item 1. Canned meat, 400 grams. Cool down, 1 minute. He understood the word cool down immediately. He'd worked in sales for 12 years. Derek crouched down and began counting aloud to 60. At 58, a weight appeared in his left palm. He looked down. In his hand lay a second can. Same label, same date, same chip in the paint on the rim. He was holding 2 identical cans and held his breath. An ordinary person in his place would have screamed. Derek began to count. 1 can per minute. 60 cans per hour. 1,440 cans a day. At this morning's rate, that's 5,700 liters of water. He stopped at that number. Then he did a second thing. He looked down the alley. The alley was empty. He took off his shirt and wrapped both cans in it. He realized the most important thing before he could even feel joy. A person with an endless supply of food in a starving city lives exactly until the moment others find out about it. At night, he checked the boundaries. He spent 6 hours on it and figured out 4 rules. A copy would only appear after a rollback. Nothing would come out before the deadline. It was impossible to copy a copy. The registry refused flatly and without explanation. Living things couldn't be entered at all. He tried to enter a mouse and was denied. And the last rule was the worst of all. The more copies of a single item he made, the longer the delay became. After the 12th can, 1 minute turned into 1 minute and 40 seconds. After the 20th, it turned into 2.5 minutes. The registry wouldn't let him flood the world with food. The registry provided exactly what was needed for trading. Derek sat on the floor amid 23 cans and realized he hadn't received a cornucopia. He'd received a warehouse. And a warehouse had to be managed. He woke Tessa at 4 o'clock. He opened a can with a knife and set it in front of her. She stared at the food and didn't move. She asked where it came from. He said he'd found it. She asked how much it had cost. He said a jacket and a watch. She ate slowly and swallowed with difficulty. Halfway through the can, she started crying. Derek didn't try to comfort her. He sat with his back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the course and how many cans he could bring to the square without anyone asking too many questions. He settled on 5. In the morning, he was the first to arrive at the exchange table. Irma Guest was laying out chalk and opening her notebook. She saw him and raised an eyebrow. She said he'd already traded for the jacket. Derek placed 1 can on the table. Miranda nodded wearily. Derek placed a second one, then a third, then a fourth and a fifth. 5 identical cans stood in a neat row. The same chip on the rim, the same date. Irma's pencil slipped from her fingers and dangled from the string. She leaned over the table and ran her fingernail along the rim of the first jar, then along the rim of the last one. She looked up, and Derek saw her expression change. First, disbelief, then calculation, then something like fear. She asked where the shipment came from. He replied that he'd found an untouched basement. She asked where. He replied that the basement was already empty. Irma was silent for a long time. Then she wrote 5 lines in her notebook and handed him 20 liters of water and a spot in line for tomorrow. She said she'd take all his goods at the morning rate. She said this more quietly than usual. Derek took the water and headed for the exit from the square. Behind his back, Irma erased the old rate from the sign and wrote down the new one. For the first time in 11 months, the price of water in Talbot had gone down. Derek didn't see this. He was looking straight ahead. Cordo was standing by the third pole. He wasn't moving. He was looking at the water bottles in Derek's hands and slowly counting them with his eyes. 1, 2, 4. Then he turned his head and said something to the person next to him. Derek didn't run. A man running with water in his hands is a sitting duck and an open invitation. He walked at a steady pace toward the northern edge of the square. He was counting. 40 steps to the alley, 200 to the embankment. It takes the fire department's crew 4 minutes to walk briskly from the fire station to the square. He had 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He turned the corner and immediately veered left between the ruins of the pharmacy and the bus wreckage. He hid 3 bottles under the bus chassis and covered them with gravel. He kept one in his hands. An empty-handed man raises more questions than a poor one. The crows emerged onto the square 4 minutes later. There were 6 of them. Cordo led the way. He pushed through the line with his shoulder and looked over people's heads. He was searching for the man with 4 bottles. He walked past the man with 1. Derek was standing in line at the water pump, holding his bottle in plain sight. He didn't look away. Guilty people look away. Cordo held his gaze on Derek for 2 seconds and moved on. 20 minutes later, the hooks left empty-handed. Derek retrieved what he'd hidden and took a different route home. He took a detour of 1.5 miles. He checked the street twice. Only then did he open the door. Tessa was asleep. Smoke from the stove hung low. Derek sat down on the floor and laid out everything he had in front of him. 23 cans, 20 liters of water, a knife, an empty registry with 2 empty slots. He knew that the second slot contained the most valuable possession in Talbot, and he had no idea how to open the third one. He tried adding water. The register accepted it. Position 2, 1.5 liters of drinking water. Cool down, 3 minutes. Water was heavier than food. The register calculated things its own way and wasn't about to explain itself. Derek tested another theory. He took a knife. The knife wasn't his. He'd found it in a wrecked car 2 months ago. The owner was lying next to it. Derek tried to enter the knife. The registry responded with a single line. Item obtained without the owner's consent. Entry not permitted. Derek stared at that line for a long time. Then he tried again with another item. He took a copper shell casing from under the bed. He traded for the shell casing fairly with a boy from the embankment for a handful of crackers back in early fall. The registry accepted it without a single objection. So the rule wasn't about one's own property or someone else's. The rule was about the method. The registry didn't recognize anything taken by force or in secret. It recognized only what a person had received by consent. Derek laughed briefly and bitterly. The world around him was built on plunder. His gift worked exactly the opposite way. In the morning, he went to see the doctor. Silas Wren lived next to a former veterinary clinic on the southern outskirts. He was in his late 50s. He'd lost his left eye even before the collapse and wore an eye patch. He had 4 vials of antibiotics left, and he guarded them like gunpowder. Derek explained the situation briefly. A cough for the 3rd week, a wheeze when breathing in, a fever that sets in by evening. Wren listened and shook his head. He said he'd seen 12 kids like that this fall. He said 11 of them were already buried behind the embankment. He said an ampule cost 40 cans and that no one in Talbot had that kind of money except the Hooks. He said this without malice. He spoke like a man who had long since given up hope. Derek asked about the price again. Wren repeated it. 40 cans for 1 ampule, and the price was non-negotiable. Derek said he'd come back that evening. Wren shrugged and went back to his test tubes. He was certain he'd never see this man again. Derek returned home and sat down to make copies. He didn't do it mindlessly. He kept track. He drew a grid on the floor with a knife and marked off each finished can. He measured the decline in his count. He watched as 1 minute stretched into 2, how 2 grew into 3.5, how after the 41st jar, 1 copy began to take 5 minutes. He calculated the limit. At this rate, the 100th jar would take half an hour, the 200th, 2 hours. The registry didn't forbid him from getting rich. The registry demanded that he do it slowly. By evening, he had exactly 40 jars in excess of his quota. It took 9 hours and 3 fainting spells right by the stove. He brought the cans to the clinic on a wheelbarrow covered with burlap. Silas Wren opened the door and saw the load. He took off his eye patch and put it back on. It was the only gesture of surprise he allowed himself. He lifted the burlap. He picked up the top jar and examined the rim. He picked up the bottom one and examined the rim. He placed them side by side. He stared at the 2 identical chips for a very long time. Then he uttered a single sentence. He said that for the first time in 11 months, he'd seen a man who delivered more than he'd promised. He didn't ask where they came from. Derek noticed this and remembered it. Wren took out an ampule and a syringe. He gave himself the injection and set aside 2 pills for the morning. He said it would be clear in 3 days. And the moment the ampule passed from his hands into Derek's, a dry click sounded in Derek's head again. An honest deal was sealed. The registry's capacity had expanded. There were 3 free slots. Derek stood in the clinic's doorway, holding onto the doorframe. He understood everything at once. The registry wasn't growing because of murders, not because of discoveries, not because of time. The registry was growing because of deals. Every closed, consensual exchange added a slot to it. His gift was designed in such a way that it forced him to trade, not to rob, not to hide, to trade. He stepped out onto the street and looked up at the gray sky. He thought about what an idiotic gift this was for a world where trade had been the first thing to die. Back home, he placed the ampule into the 3rd slot. The cooldown was 9 hours. He wasn't upset. 9 hours for the medicine his sister's life depended on. It was the best deal of his life. He set the alarm by candlelight and lay down next to Tessa. Her breathing had evened out. In the morning, in the square, he heard the news. Irma Guest had lowered the price from yesterday's 4 liters to 3.5. People stood there, bewildered. Prices in Talbot never fell. They only went up. Old Esther Wimes had been standing in line at the water pump for the 6th month in a row and kept her own separate list. She approached Derek herself. She said she remembered his father. She said she'd heard about the basement. She said there were no basements left in Talbot and that she'd checked them all. Derek replied that she should have looked further down. She looked up at him and said she didn't care where the food came from. She said there were 9 children and 4 elderly people in her line. She asked him straight out if he'd sell her water at 3 liters per jug. Derek did the math. He could. He agreed. And a switch flipped in his head again. The registry's capacity had expanded. There were 4 free slots. He watched the old woman walk away and, for the first time in 11 months, felt not fear, but excitement. Every exchange made him stronger, literally, not figuratively. He tested this on 3 consecutive deals by lunchtime and was convinced. Small deals yielded the same slot as large ones. The registry didn't count volume. The registry counted consent. By evening, he had 6 slots and a reputation as a man with a basement. He brought in drinking water. He brought in crackers. He brought in a sack of salt traded for 8 cans from the mechanic Odin Brass. Salt in the New World cost almost as much as meat. Nothing could be stored without it. He got carried away and let his guard down. He paid the price for that. On the 4th day, Garth Mulder came to the square. He never came to the market. He kept 26 men in Talbot and preferred to sit at the fire station and collect his cut. He was about 40. He was lean and sinewy and wore 3 iron hooks on leather loops on his left sleeve, 1 for each year since the collapse. He climbed onto a concrete block by the water pump and waited for silence. Silence fell after 9 seconds. He spoke briefly. He announced that starting tomorrow, every transaction in Talbot would go through the men with hooks. He said the hooks would take a quarter of every deal. He said that Irma Guest's notebook was being moved to the fire station. He said that anyone who traded outside the system would be hanged from the 8th pole. The crowd was silent. Irma Guest stood at her table, holding the notebook with both hands. She didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. Then Garth Mulder said one last thing. He said that food had appeared in town. He said it had been coming from somewhere in a steady stream for 4 days straight. He said he would find that basement by the end of the week. Derek held Garth Mulder's gaze for exactly as long as any frightened person would. No less, no more. Then he looked away and stared at the ground like everyone else. That saved his life. Mulder was looking for someone who would flinch. Derek didn't flinch. He hadn't slept that night. He sat by the stove and laid out the problem just as he used to lay out shipping documents at his old job. Mulder had 26 guns. Derek had a knife and a sister with a fever. He couldn't fight. There was nowhere to run. Winter was coming from the north, and the first snow was expected in a month. Outside the city, a man without shelter would die within a week. That left a third option. Derek knew one thing about the warehouses that no one else in the square knew. The warehouse isn't controlled by the one with the lock. It's controlled by the one who keeps the records. Mulder had seized the notebook. Mulder hadn't seized their trust. In the morning, the Hooks came out into the square and began collecting a quarter. People handed it over in silence. By noon, the line at the water pump had shrunk by half. Not because they've gotten drunk, because it no longer made sense. People would bring their last bit to exchange and walk away with 3/4 of what they'd had. By evening, 2 people had left town altogether. Esther Weems told Derek by the water fountain that her list had shrunk by 2 names in a day. She said this in an even voice. She had long since forgotten how to cry. Derek asked how many people were in her line. She said 41. He asked how many of them could carry a load. She said 19. He asked her to gather those 19 behind the embankment at 6 in the morning. She asked why. He said there would be water. She looked him in the face and didn't ask any more questions. For the next 5 days, Derek worked non-stop. He wouldn't describe those days to anyone himself. 3 snapshots remained in his memory. The first, the night of the 3rd day. He's sitting on the basement floor amid 112 bottles, counting his kickback aloud. His voice cracks as he reaches the 4th 100. He takes a drink every other bottle. Second, the morning of the 4th day. A kid named Nix drags an empty crate over on a wheelbarrow. He collects bottles all over Talbot and gets 1 can a day for it. He doesn't ask any questions. He looks into the basement through a crack in the door and has kept silent about what he saw for 3 years. The 3rd, evening of the 5th day. Odin Brass welds 2 carts for Derek out of a refrigerator frame and says he'll take payment in crackers instead of cans. He says the town will soon be sick of cans. He's wrong. He's more wrong than anyone in Talbot. On the 6th, Derek brought 200 liters of water and 180 cans to 8 Pillars Square. He did it openly. He parked the carts by the 2nd pillar and wrote his rate in chalk on the concrete. 1 can for 5 liters. Hook's rate was 3.5. Derek's rate was 5. The square fell silent. The first person to approach wasn't a customer. The first to approach was Cordo. He was alone. He smirked and reached for the cart. Derek didn't try to stop him. He took a step back and said one sentence loudly. He said that the water was free for those standing in Esther Wimes's line. Behind Cordo, 19 people from the embankment stepped out onto the square at the same time. They weren't armed. They simply stood there. Behind them, the line at the water pump began to grow. Then those who had already finished their business approached. Cordo looked back and saw about 70 people in front of him. He was stronger than any one of them. He was weaker than all 70. He withdrew his hand. He said that Mulder would find out about this. Derek replied that that was the plan. The trading went on for 4 hours. Derek sold 5 liters per can and took no extra charge. He kept track of every transaction with a pencil on a board. He called out a name. He called out the amount. He called out the balance. People listened to their numbers and couldn't believe someone was keeping track of them out loud. By the end of the day, something had clicked in Derek's head 49 times. 49 honest deals. 49 entries. The ledger had grown so long that Derek could no longer see it all at once and had learned to scan the list with his eyes. He'd recorded everything he could get his hands on: nails, soap, kerosene, rags, 2 pairs of size 43 boots, a truck battery, a pack of chlorine tablets. Every item became endless. Every item became slow. The ledger maintained balance with an iron fist. Mira Colt appeared in the square toward evening. She was about 30. She carried a rifle on her back, barrel down, and walked so quietly that Derek didn't notice her until she stood by the cart. She was the best hunter for 8 miles around and charged 10 cans a day for guiding caravans. She looked at the exchange rate scrawled on the concrete and said that anyone with a rate like that was either a fool or a dead man. Derek replied that he was a storekeeper. She asked what the difference was. He said that a storekeeper counts turnover, not profit. She didn't understand. He explained it more simply. He said you could strip the town bare in a week and be left alone among the corpses. He said you could take a little at a time and keep doing it for years. Mira Colt was silent for a long time. Then she asked how much he paid for security. He said he didn't pay in cans. He said he paid in bullets. She laughed in his face. She said that no one in Talbot had any bullets left except the Khrushchevs, and that even they had fewer than 200. Derek reached into his pocket and placed a copper shell casing on the cart. Then a second one. Then a third. All 3 were identical. Same factory, same year. The same dent on the rim. He laid out 9 in a row and stopped. Mira Colt stopped laughing on the 4th one. She picked up 2 casings and pressed their bases together. She looked up, and Derek saw the hunter's calm slip from her face. What remained was something very attentive and very hungry. She said she needed a full round, not a shell casing. He replied that for that, he needed 1 real round, obtained honestly. She took a pouch off her belt and counted out 5 rounds. She said that was half her supply. She said that if he was lying, she'd be back that night. He took the rounds and entered one into the registry in her presence. The delay was 4 hours. He honestly told her that number. She nodded. She said that 4 hours meant the 12th round by morning. She said it was worth fighting for. That's how Derek got his first shooter. That night, the hooks came for the goods. There were 9 of them. They were heading toward the house by the embankment and made no attempt to hide. At the corner by the burned-down pharmacy, the first one took a shotgun blast to the thigh. The second one went down on his own. The remaining 7 took cover and stayed in the ditch for 40 minutes under sporadic fire from above. Mira Colt fired from the roof of the water tower, changing her position after every 2 shots. She didn't kill anyone except the first one. That's exactly what Derek had asked for. Dead hooks would have brought blood revenge. The wounded would have brought a bill for medical treatment. In the morning, Garth Mulder received 2 cripples and 7 men who had lain in the mud all night. He also received something worse. He received a rumor. By lunchtime, all of Talbot knew that the man on the embankment was holding out, drinking 5 liters of water at a time, and that he had a gun and ammunition. Derek didn't celebrate. He sat with Tessa and listened to her breathing. The wheezing had almost completely gone away. She asked to go outside. He wouldn't let her. She asked why. He told her the truth. He said that now they'd be looking for them in earnest. He turned out to be right sooner than he thought. That same evening at the fire station, Hart Mulder sat across from a man in a clean jacket. The jacket was military issue and without a single stain. In Talbot, that meant more than any words. The man introduced himself as the assistant commandant of the Ridge. The Ridge stood on a hill 9 miles to the east and was armed with 200 rifles and a working generator. The assistant commandant placed a can of stew on the table. That very one. The one with the chip on the rim. He said that over the past 8 days, 109 such cans had arrived at Graben from 4 different merchants. He said that all 109 were identical, down to the last scratch. He asked Mulder where the source was. Mulder replied that the source was in Talbot and that he would uncover it. The assistant commandant shook his head. He said there was no need to investigate any further. He said that Commandant Wayne Tallis had already made a decision. He said that in 2 days, the Ridge would enter Talbot and take the town under protection. He pronounced the word protection very carefully. Mulder understood him correctly. The column entered Talbot not in 2 days, but in a day and a half. They arrived at dawn and did everything right. 3 trucks blocked the road from the east. 40 men in identical gray jackets took control of 8 Pillars Square in 11 minutes. No one fired a shot. That was the plan. Wayne Tallis didn't wage war on cities. He took them over. He was the last to climb out of the lead truck and surveyed the square without interest. He was nearing 50. He was heavy-set and slow and kept his hands in his pockets. He had the face of a man who had spent 20 years signing documents and, once in his life, had signed a very terrible one. He didn't raise his voice even once all morning. First, his men took down the 2 men hanged by the hooks from the 8th pillar and buried them. The crowd saw this. The crowd appreciated it. Next, they disarmed the hooks. Mulder's 26 men surrendered their weapons without a single shot being fired. Hart Mulder handed over his 3 hooks himself and remained standing in the front row with empty sleeves. His life was spared. Derek watched this and realized he was witnessing the most dangerous thing of the entire morning. Tallis hadn't killed the enemy. Tallis had hired him. As his third move, Graben began distributing rations. They set up a cauldron of hot porridge in the square and handed out half a ladleful to each person. The porridge was runny. It was hot. Talbot's men stood there crying over their tin bowls. By noon, the town belonged entirely to Graben, without a fight. They came for Derek at 3 o'clock. They came politely. 4 men in gray jackets knocked on the door and waited for it to open. The senior officer gave the commandant's name and said they were waiting for him in the square. He didn't say the word arrest. He didn't say the word invitation. He simply waited at the threshold. Mira Colt was lying in the attic across the way, keeping the senior officer in her sights. Derek knew that. Derek knew something else, too. 200 guns on the hill against a single hunter. That's not a fight. It's a way to bury a sister. He went out on his own. He told Mira not to move and hoped she'd listen. She did. The conversation took place in the former bank on the corner of the square. Tallis sat in an office chair by the window, warming his hands on a mug. He offered the mug to Derek. Derek took it. Refusing would have looked like fear. Tallis spoke calmly and slowly. He said he knew about 109 identical cans. He said he didn't believe in basements. He said he'd worked in supply for 23 years and knew what a batch from a single conveyor belt looked like and what a batch from a single mold looked like. He said Derek made food. He didn't ask how. He said he didn't care how. Then he laid out the terms. Combe takes Talbot under his protection. Combe provides the city with walls, guard posts, and a generator. Derek hands over half of his production to Combe. Half. Not a quarter like Hooks. Half. In return, he gets his life, protection, and the status of the city's supplier. Derek asked what would happen if he refused. Tallis took a sip from his mug and replied calmly. He said that in that case, he'd have to refer the matter to his quartermaster. He said the quartermaster was a straightforward man who worked quickly. He said Derek wouldn't like it. He didn't threaten him even once during the entire conversation. Derek did the math. He counted 60 seconds in silence. Half of infinity is still infinity. Half of a slow rollback is half the speed. The registry didn't grow from threats, nor did it grow from submission. The registry grew only from consent. And most importantly, Tallis was offering a deal. That meant the registry would count it. Derek agreed, and a switch flipped in his mind. The registry's capacity had expanded. He had agreed to the robbery and had grown stronger. He realized in that very second that his gift did not distinguish between justice. It distinguished only between forms. A contract is a contract. He buried this discovery very deep inside. Graben's quartermaster was a man named Crane. He was 35. He was thin and angry and wore a cord around his neck with a lead weight for balancing. He believed in nothing but scales. He met Derek at the first truck and said outright that he considered him a fraud. He said he'd seen 14 different schemes in 11 months. He said they all ended with false bottoms and double walls. He demanded that the shipment be opened in his presence. Derek brought 40 cans out to the yard. Crane opened 6 of them at random. He weighed each one before and after. He poured the contents into bowls and rubbed the meat between his fingers. He checked the seam of the rim with his fingernail. He did this for 40 minutes without saying a word. Then he took 2 empty cans and matched the chips on the rims. The chip fit into the chip perfectly. He picked up a third one. The same thing happened. He lined them up and took a step back. He stared at the row for a very long time. Then he sat down right on the concrete and let his hands fall between his knees. He said one sentence. He said that he'd managed warehouses for 12 years and had always believed that there was no such thing as an endless supply. He said that now he'd have to learn to count all over again. He looked up at Derek, and there was neither malice nor greed in his eyes. There was the anguish of a man who had just had the rule by which he lived taken away from him. Derek held out his hand and suggested they keep the overall tally together. Crane didn't take his hand right away. Half an hour later, he was already sketching a 2-column table on the concrete. Greben set up 6 posts in Talbot and drove stakes into the ground for the future wall. The generator arrived on the 4th day. It provided light for the square and for Silas Wren's clinic for 4 hours a day. For the first time in a year, the people of Talbot saw an electric lamp. Nix was already collecting containers with 3 assistants. Odin Brass stopped surviving on crackers and opened his workshop. Esther Wimes crossed one name off her list. The child had survived. The town came back to life in 9 days. Derek worked 16-hour days. He managed 9 projects simultaneously and kept track of 9 kickbacks in his head. 1.5 liters of water, 3 minutes. 400 grams of canned meat, 5 minutes and 40 seconds. A cartridge, 4 hours. Half a kilo of salt, 1 hour and 10 minutes. A chlorine tablet, 12 minutes. 1 liter of kerosene, 9 minutes. Soap, 8 minutes. 100 nails, 4 minutes. A battery, 11 hours. He slept fitfully between cycles and woke up by candlelight. Tessa started helping out. She drew lines on the board and counted better than many adults. Derek wouldn't let her step outside the door. She stopped asking why. Everything went well for exactly 17 days. The problem didn't come from the hooks or from the east. The problem came from arithmetic. Crane was the first to notice it. He approached Derek with 2 boards and laid out both columns. He said that in the first week, Derek had been giving out 200 cans a day. He said that in the 3rd week, Derek was giving out 190. He said this was with the same number of working hours. Derek looked at the numbers and felt a chill in his stomach. He knew the reason. The backlog was growing with every copy and would keep growing forever. It never shrunk. The 1,000th can took 9 minutes. The 2,000th would take 18. The registry wasn't a well. The registry was a spring. The longer he stretched it, the harder it became. And then Derek realized a second thing that was far worse than the first. He was no longer feeding just the 200 people of Talbot. He was feeding Talbot and the Ridge. 430 people. Tallis was settling new people in the city every week and taking his half. The consumption curve was rising. The production curve was falling. Crane drew 2 lines on the board and pointed to where they intersected. He said that, under these circumstances, in 6 weeks the city would start starving again. He said that now 430 people would be starving instead of 200. He said that Derek hadn't saved Talbot. Derek had merely postponed his death and made it worse. Derek stood over the board and said nothing. He searched for a way out, but couldn't find one. There was only one way out. They needed new entries, not more copies of the same one, but more variety. Each new entry reset the count to 0. That meant they had to get things, lots of things, good things. And just then, Wayne Tallis walked into the former bank with a piece of paper in his hand and said he had a proposal. He said that 19 miles to the north stood the Ark 4 military warehouse. He said the warehouse was intact and had been locked since the collapse. He said it contained generators, medical supplies, and army rations for 2,000 people. He said the depot was guarded by a garrison of 60 men under the command of a man named Travis Shaw. He placed the paper on the table and made his final point. He said that Shaw had sent a letter. Shaw was inviting the town's supplier, Talbot, to come and discuss the exchange in person. Derek took the letter and read it twice. The paper was thick and white. There was no paper like this left anywhere in Talbot. The text was brief and polite. Travis Shaw invited the town's supplier to negotiations regarding an exchange and guaranteed his safety during the visit and on the return trip. The signature was genuine. So was the seal. Derek looked at the seal longer than he did at the text. A man who, 11 months after the end of the world, still uses seals is either a madman or the most dangerous sort of person imaginable. Mira Colt read the letter over his shoulder and said one word. She said it was a trap. Crane said it was a trap. Silas Wren said it was a trap. Tallis said nothing. He stood by the window and looked out at the square. Derek asked him point blank why the commandant would let his only supplier fall into enemy hands. Tallis answered honestly. He said that Ark 4 was stationed on the highway and holding the northern route. He said that the Ridge had tried to take that warehouse in the 6th month and lost 29 men in a single night. He said they wouldn't try it again. He said that now he had something he didn't have back then. He had the goods that Shaw needed more than walls. Derek realized he was being sold, not crudely, carefully, like a rare tool for rent. He agreed to go. He had no choice, and he knew it. 6 weeks until the famine isn't a deadline. It's a suspended sentence. They spent 2 days packing. 3 snapshots remain in his memory from those 48 hours. First, night. Derek sits in the basement and counts the kickbacks for all 9 positions one last time. He jots them down on a scrap of paper and hands it to Crane. Crane reads it and says he now understands why Derek never sleeps. Second, morning. Odin Brass welds double sides onto the truck bed and builds a 9-compartment hiding place under the floor. He doesn't ask what it's for. He says that a man on the road needs a place that no one will find. Third, noon on the second day. Mira Colt is taking apart and cleaning her rifle on the porch while explaining to the boy, Nix, how to read tracks on gravel. Nix is riding along with them as a scout. He's 14. Derek tried 3 times to leave him behind and lost the argument 3 times. Before they left, there was one more thing to do. Derek went to see Silas Wren and left Tessa with him. He didn't explain why. Wren didn't ask. He just said that the girl was sleeping in his back room and that no living soul had slept there in 11 months. Tessa clung to her brother's sleeve and wouldn't let go. She said he wouldn't come back. She said this without tears. Derek took the copper cap on a string off his neck and gave it to her. He said he'd come back for her. He didn't say when. He'd forbidden himself from lying about specific dates from the very first day. They left at 4 in the morning. 1 truck, 8 men. Mira on the cab roof, Nix on the running board, Crane in the bed with the tally boards. Tallis provided 4 of his shooters and said they were security. Everyone knew it was a convoy. The northern highway ran through desolate fields. The ground was gray and hard. Cars abandoned in the first few weeks still stood along the shoulders. All the doors were open. The interiors had been gutted. At the 9th mile, they passed a settlement of 14 houses. It was empty. Not looted, just empty. The people had left on their own and locked the doors. Nick said the tracks were old, about 3 months. He said they hadn't fled in a panic, but had left in a column. Mira said they march in a column toward whoever is calling them. At the 15th mile, the posts began. They'd been driven into the ground recently. A tin sign with the same symbol hung on each one, a square and the number 4, every 200 steps. Arc 4 was marking its territory 4 miles ahead. Crane said that's what the non-survivors do. That's what the government does. The warehouse came into view at the 17th mile. Derek had expected a concrete hangar. Instead, he saw a base. A perimeter of concrete blocks twice a person's height. Watchtowers at the corners. Real gates with electric drives. Beyond the gates were neat rows of warehouse buildings and an antenna on a mast. And the most unbelievable thing of all, lights were on above the central building. In the daytime. In broad daylight. Travis Shaw was wasting electricity for no reason. It was a message, and everyone in the truck got it. The gates opened without any negotiation. They were expecting them. 12 men in crisp uniforms stood on the parade ground. They stood at attention. Travis Shaw stepped forward. He was about 45. He was fit and gray-haired, and he held his back so straight it was as if his spine were made of rebar. He shook hands with everyone, including the young boy Nix. He apologized for the long journey. He offered them a chance to wash up with hot water. That finished them off for good. The conversation began an hour later in the office with a map on the wall. Shaw spoke quickly and to the point. He said that the warehouse contained 86,000 dry rations, 14 generators, 2 metric tons of medical supplies, and 5,000 sets of equipment. He said this wasn't going to save the world. He said it would last exactly 2 years for 60 people and not a day longer. He said the warehouse didn't produce anything. The warehouse only consumed resources. He said he'd been counting the days since the first month, and that there was a calendar hanging in his office with the dates crossed out. He showed them the calendar. 1/3 of the dates had been crossed out. Then he set a can of stewed meat with a chip on the rim on the table. He said that over the past 3 weeks, he'd received 140 such cans. He said he'd opened them himself. He said all 140 were from the same batch. He looked Derek in the face and asked a single question. He asked if this would go on forever. Derek didn't answer right away. He weighed his 2 options for 8 seconds. He could have lied. Lying came naturally to him. But sitting across from him was a man who had burned through 4 hours worth of generator fuel just to prove he could. You don't lie to someone like that twice. Derek told half the truth. He said he could reproduce any object he'd obtained honestly. He said that each subsequent copy took longer than the previous one. He said that endlessly didn't mean quickly. Travis Shaw was silent for 40 seconds. Then he stood up and walked over to the map. He pointed at it with his palm and said something that made the room grow cold. He said that 9 warehouses of this type were marked on this map. He said that Arc 4 was the only one left standing. He said that the other 8 had been broken into and emptied within the first 100 days. He said that humanity isn't dying from a lack of food. Humanity is dying because supplies are finite and production has ground to a halt. He turned and said one last thing. He said that Derek Vale is the only functioning factory on the continent. He proposed a deal. Arc 4 grants Derek access to every item in the warehouse for restocking. Every single one. Rations, generators, medications, weapons. In exchange, Derek moves into the warehouse under the garrison's protection and works to restore supplies to the entire region. Shaw called it restoration. He said it with complete sincerity. Derek did the math. 86,000 rations aren't 86,000. It's one inventory item and an endless rollback from zero. 2 metric tons of medical supplies are 40 inventory items. 5,000 kits are another 12. He was logging more entries in a single day than he'd entered in a month at Talbot. The production curve was rising. The point of starvation was being pushed back by years. It was a lifeline. And it was a betrayal of the entire city. Derek asked what would happen to Talbot. Shaw replied calmly that Talbot would receive its shipments on schedule. Derek asked who would set the schedule. Shaw replied that he would. That was it. Derek understood how this would end in a year. He saw it as clearly as the chart on the board. The person controlling the schedule controls everyone. And then Derek made a move no one expected from him. He said he'd agree to everything except the move. He said he'd enter the orders here, but work in Talbot. He explained it this way. He said that kickbacks don't depend on location. He said that a factory should be where people live, not where the walls stand. He was half lying, and he knew Shaw could sense it. Travis Shaw looked at him for a very long time. Then he smiled for the first time during the entire conversation. He said he respected the offer. He said he'd give an answer in the morning. There was no answer. That night, shooting broke out at the warehouse. Derek woke up to a short burst of gunfire near the east wing. Mira Colt was already on her feet, holding a rifle. Nix burst into the room through the window and blurted out 3 words. He said the garrison was firing on their own men. They made their way out into the hallway. People in uniform were running across the parade ground. 2 of the 4 streetlights were lit. 3 bodies lay by the gate. Travis Shaw stood on the steps of the central building with a pistol in his lowered hand, looking toward the eastern perimeter. Derek ran up to him and asked what was going on. Shaw replied without turning around. He said that 6 of his men had broken into the armory and left through the east gate 20 minutes ago. He said they'd taken a truck and a radio. Derek asked why. Then Shaw turned, and Derek saw something on his face that hadn't been there all day. Fear. Real fear. Shaw said they hadn't just taken the truck. He said they'd taken the list of locations and the recording of today's conversation. He said that in 2 days, every gang on the northern route would know about the man with the endless warehouse. He said that last part, and it was the worst of all. He asked Derek where his sister was right now. Derek replied that his sister was in Talbot, seeing the doctor. Travis Shaw closed his eyes for a second. He said that was bad. He said the fugitives wouldn't head north, but west, toward Rusty Pass, and that from there it was a 4-day march in column to Talbot. Derek turned toward the gate. Shaw grabbed him by the shoulder and held him back. He said one sentence that stopped Derek more effectively than any physical restraint. He said that if Derek left empty-handed now, he'd arrive in Talbot and die there alongside his sister in a week. Derek stood there, breathing. 2 of the 4 lamps on the parade ground were lit. 3 people were being carried out through the gate. He did the math. 4 days. Half a day for the return trip. He had 3.5 days left and 1 chance to avoid coming back empty-handed. He turned to Shaw and said he'd leave in the morning. He said he needed the warehouse by morning. All of it. Unlocked. Shaw asked how many positions he could take over the course of the night. Derek replied that he didn't know. He said that entering each one took between 30 seconds and a minute. He said the math was simple. 8 hours was roughly 500 minutes. Shaw looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then he shouted at the warehouse supervisor to open all the gates and remove the seals. He said it so calmly, as if he were giving an order about breakfast. 23 years in supply had taught him to calculate faster than to panic. It was the longest night of Derek Vale's life. 4 segments remain from it. The first. Ward number 2. Shelves reaching the ceiling. A 700-gram dry ration in olive green packaging. Derek places his palm on the package and waits for the click. Item checked off. He walks along the shelf, checking off the next item every 12 steps. Nix runs alongside the flashlight and counts aloud. He loses count at 42 and starts over. Second, medical building. It would take Silas Wren 3 lifetimes to see this many boxes. Derek doesn't know the names of half the medications. He carries everything in order, row by row. Ampules, powders, sterile kits, surgical sutures, saline solution in plastic bags. He stops only once. He sees a box containing that very antibiotic for which he traded 40 cans. He carries it in and stands over it for 2 seconds longer than over the rest. Third, the technical building. A generator weighing 190 kilograms. Derek places both palms on it. The registry takes longer than usual to process the data. Position accepted. Countdown, 31 hours. Crane writes the number on the board and says it's the most expensive line in the world. Fourth, the armory. Travis Shaw opens it himself and stands nearby the whole time. He doesn't move a step away. He watches as Derek brings in a box of ammunition, an assault rifle magazine, and a Class 4 body armor vest. He doesn't say a word. When Derek reaches for the box of grenades, Shaw silently places his hand on top of it. Derek pulls his hand away and moves on. It was the only refusal all night, and both of them remembered it. By 6 in the morning, the registry held 473 items. Derek couldn't list them all. He could only flip through the pages. He sat on the concrete by building number 2 and realized he was no longer a man with a can of stew. He had become a walking warehouse. Dana Fisk was a sergeant on the eastern perimeter. She was 28. She had lost 2 of her squad that night and blamed Derek for it all. She said it to his face on the parade ground in front of everyone. She said that before he arrived at the warehouse, no one had fired a shot at their own men in 11 months. She said she didn't believe in any kind of endless production and that she saw before her an ordinary con artist who was responsible for the deaths of her men. Derek didn't argue. He asked her for an unloaded magazine from her own assault rifle. She handed it over with a smirk. He entered the magazine into the registry in her presence and called out the countdown. 22 minutes. He sat down on the steps and waited. Dana Fisk waited with him. She stood over him for 22 minutes without saying a word. At the 22nd minute, a second magazine appeared in Derek's hand. The same chip on the heel. The same scratch by the feeder window. She took both and held them side by side. Then she looked at the east gate through which the 6 had left, then back at the magazines. Her face went blank. She sat down next to Derek right on the steps and covered her face with her hands. She said she now understood exactly what those 6 had gone after. She said that until that moment, she thought they'd just chickened out. An hour later, she volunteered to go with him. Travis Shaw sent 4 men, including Fisk. He said he couldn't do any more. He said he had 54 men and a perimeter of 1 kilometer 800. He said one more thing as a farewell. He said the warehouse was now known and that they would come for it. He asked for only one thing. He asked that if Arc 4 fell, the positions would remain intact. Derek replied that they were already intact. We left at 7. 2 trucks, 12 men. The road back was rough. At the 9th mile, near the deserted village of Nix, he stopped the convoy and climbed down from the running board. He crouched by the roadside and stared at the gravel for about 3 minutes. Then he said a vehicle had spent the night here. One. A heavy one. It had been there for 6 hours and had headed west. Mira Colt checked and confirmed it. She said the fugitives had split up and that one of them had been watching the warehouse all night. Derek did the math again. If they were being followed, then his entire list was already being transported in 2 directions. He ordered them to drive non-stop. They arrived in Talbot at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The town had changed in 3 days. The posts along the wall weren't just driven into the ground. A net had been stretched between them and filled with bags of gravel. A second boiler stood in 8 pillars square. A canopy had been erected over the water pump. There were noticeably more people. Derek counted the faces and didn't recognize half of them. Graben was settling in new arrivals every day. He jumped down from the running board and walked straight to Silas Wren's house. The clinic's door was open. Inside, a lamp powered by a generator was lit. Wren was sitting at a table, sorting through test tubes. He looked up, and Derek understood everything from the look on his face before he even heard a word. Tessa wasn't in the back room. Wren spoke briefly. He said they'd come for the girl on the second day. He said they'd come politely and unarmed. He said they'd taken her to the ridge. He said the commandant had sent a written message stating that the child needed proper food, a doctor, and 4 walls. He said it was signed with the word care. Derek stood in the doorway, holding onto the doorframe for the 2nd time that month. Wren added one more sentence, and it weighed heavier than everything else. He said he hadn't resisted. He said he had 9 sick people on his hands, and that if he'd resisted, they would have shut off the generator. He said he'd chosen the 9. He said he'd have to live with that now. Derek didn't blame him. He thought it over and realized that if he were in Wren's shoes, he would have done the same thing. He turned around and walked toward the former bank. Wayne Tallis was sitting in the same office chair by the window, warming his hands on the same mug. He wasn't surprised. He offered the mug. Derek didn't take it. Tallis set it on the windowsill and spoke first. He said he was glad the supplier had returned alive. He said he'd heard about the shooting at the Ark. He said the girl was safe and eating well, and that she'd been given a room with a window. He said she could return to Talbot at any time, once Talbot became as safe as the Ridge. He didn't make any threats. He'd never once made a threat in all the time they'd known each other. Derek counted aloud. He said that in 9.5 days, using half of his production, Graben had built a wall, installed 2 boilers, and housed 140 people. He said that was good work. He said that now Graben had a wall, boilers, people, and his sister. He asked which items on that list the commandant was willing to give back. Tallis replied calmly. He said he'd give everything back once the supplier stopped coming to negotiations without him. That was the whole point. Tallis wasn't afraid of competitors. Tallis was afraid that someone else would buy his tool. Derek nodded. He said he understood. He didn't press the issue. He didn't make any threats. He simply said they had a more pressing problem and laid Crane's boards on the table. He told him about the deserters. He told him about the rusty path. He set a deadline, 3 days. Tallis listened without interrupting. Then he stood up, walked over to the map on the wall, and stared intently at the western direction for a long time. He said he knew about the Rusty Pass. He said it wasn't a gang. He said it was 9 settlements connected by a single road, and that a man named Tarn Wexler was based there, controlling 400 guns and the only functioning oil refinery in the entire West. He said that Wexler sells fuel to anyone and everyone, and that's exactly why no one messes with him. He turned and added one last thing. He said that in 11 months, Wexler hadn't attacked a single person. He said Wexler had no reason to. Everyone comes to him on their own. Crane looked up from the board and said exactly what Derek was thinking. He said that now Wexler had a reason. He said that a fuel trader would go bankrupt instantly if a second infinite commodity appeared in the world. Derek looked at his 473 positions and, for the first time, understood a simple truth. He was no longer saving the city from starvation. He was bringing down another country's economy simply by virtue of his existence. Tallis said he'd provide 80 guns and all of Talbot's walls. He said he wanted a doubled share in return. Derek agreed. Something clicked in his mind. That night, Mira Colt woke him up at 3:30. She was standing in the doorway with a rifle and said they'd seen headlights on the Western Highway. Derek went out onto the embankment and looked. A string of lights was creeping across the dead field 4 miles away. He counted them twice and lost count both times. There were more than 30. They didn't arrive in 3 days. They arrived in 11 hours. Garth Mulder was the first to stand on the embankment. He had gone out there before Derek and before Mira. He stood there without the hooks on his sleeves, looking at the string of lights in the field. He had had this town by the throat for 11 months and knew everything about it. He knew that Talbot wouldn't survive a proper siege. He knew that the wall of wire mesh and rubble could stop a bullet, but not a truck. He knew that each of the Ridge's 80 riflemen had 9 rounds per barrel. He calculated all this in a minute and realized he could see the end coming. Then the storekeeper stood next to him and said they wouldn't hold the wall. Mulder decided the man had lost his mind. Derek redeployed his men in 40 minutes. He wasn't building a defense, he was setting up a supply depot. He ordered the entire stockpile to be brought out of the basement and distributed across 6 points along the inner ring. He stationed 1 man with a clip at each point. He ordered Crane to keep track of the distribution. He ordered Odin Brass to light the brazier. He ordered Nix to round up all the boys who could run. And only after that did he sit down on a crate in the middle of the square and begin to count. By the night of the 8th day, Derek had 3 rounds left. The first, half of the third. He's sitting on a crate, holding an assault rifle magazine in his hands. A line of 14 people stands nearby. Every 22 minutes, a full magazine appears in his palm. He hands it to the first person in line, and that person runs to the wall. The line moves forward. No one speaks. All that can be heard is Crane's counting. Second, 4 a.m. Dana Fisk is handing out Class 4 body armor vests. There are 6 of them. The rotation at this position is 40 minutes. She puts a vest on a person, sends him to his position, and an hour later takes the vest off him and puts it on the next person. She works through the line according to the list and doesn't skip anyone. Third, 5:40 a.m. Odin Brass is welding road spikes from scrap steel strips. He's placing them in 3 rows around the bend near the burned-out pharmacy. He hasn't slept for 2 days. He laughs as he works. He says that for the first time in his life, he doesn't mind wasting metal. The rusty March column had stopped 2 miles away and didn't move any further until dawn. That was a mistake. Tarn Wexler didn't come himself. The column was commanded by a man named Beck Lowry, that very same deserter. He brought a list of positions with him and wanted a position in exchange for it, not money. He brought 32 vehicles and 240 men and was certain that would be enough for a town of 200 walkers. He expected to enter by lunchtime. By lunchtime, he had lost 9 vehicles. The assault began at 7. They advanced along the road from the east, where the wall was at its lowest. The first 3 trucks ran into Odin spike strips and came to a halt across the road. The 4th tried to go around them on the shoulder and got stuck in a ditch. Mira Colt was firing from the water tower, targeting only the wheels and windows. She didn't kill anyone that day before noon, and by doing so, she stopped more people than she would have killed with bursts of fire. 80 of Graben's gunmen held the inner ring. Each had 9 rounds at the start of the battle. By 9 in the morning, each still had 9 rounds. Nix's boys ran from the square to the positions every 20 minutes, bringing magazines in salt sacks. Lowry's men didn't understand what was happening. They were used to the simple arithmetic of a siege. The besieged keep firing until they run out of ammo. Then they're taken. Here, the besieged didn't run out. One of the assault troops later said he'd thought there was an army depot in the town. He was almost right. Garth Mulder was holding the southern sector with 12 of his former hooks. Their weapons were returned to them at 4 in the morning. Tallis did this without discussion. Mulder received an assault rifle and 4 magazines and couldn't believe his eyes. By 11, he'd fired them all and went to the square to vent his anger. He was certain they'd now tell him to hold his ground with his bayonet. He walked up to Derek and saw what caused him to remain silent for the next 2 days. He saw the storekeeper sitting on a crate in the middle of the square, surrounded by 6 crates of magazines. He saw a heavy object appear of its own accord in the man's empty palm. He saw Crane mark a line on the board and call out a number, 209. Mulder stood there, watching it for 8 seconds. Then he sat down on the gravel right where he'd been standing. He took the bandana off his head and wiped his face. He said the only thing he could. He said that for 11 months he'd been taking a quarter of this town's food. He said he could have just asked. He took 4 new magazines and headed south, not saying another word until evening. By noon, Lowry realized he was approaching the town the wrong way. He changed his strategy. He left the road and marched in 2 groups along the bed of the dried-up river, bypassing the embankment. It was a smart move. The riverbed couldn't be fired upon from the tower. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 40 men from Rusty March had reached the northern edge of Talbot and found themselves 200 paces from the supply cellar. They were met by 19 men from Esther Weems' unit. None of them had ever held a weapon before. All 19 were wearing body armor and had full magazines, and they were terrible shots. They missed almost everyone. They didn't retreat a single step. The battle in the riverbed lasted 40 minutes and decided everything. For the first time in 11 months, Lowry's men faced an enemy that didn't hold back on ammunition. Psychologically, this breaks you faster than any casualties. By 2 o'clock, they had been pushed back. By 3, Beck Lowry ordered a retreat. He lost 9 vehicles, 19 men killed, and about 60 wounded. Talbot lost 4. 2 of them were from Weems's squad. Esther crossed 2 names off the list and didn't cry. She told Derek by the water pump that for the first time in 11 months, she wasn't crossing them off because of hunger. She said it was a different feeling and that she didn't like it, but she'd cope with it. Derek hadn't slept for 41 hours. He stood up from the crate and collapsed on the spot. They carried him to the clinic. Silas Wren examined him and said it was exhaustion and that a person couldn't enter entries into the registry without food or sleep. He said the body pays the price for every copy. Derek slept for 11 hours straight for the first time since the collapse. He woke up in the evening and saw Wayne Tallis standing by his bunk. The commandant was sitting on a stool, holding a crane board in his hands. He was looking at the distribution figures. 2,240 stores in a single day. He said that in 9 years of service in logistics, he'd never seen anything like it. He said he now understood why they'd come for Derek so quickly. He said that Talbot had held his ground. And then he said what he'd come to say. He said that Talbot had held out against 240 men with just 200 of his own. He said that Tarn Wexler had 400 guns and that this wasn't Wexler's army. He said it was a reconnaissance in force and that Wexler had paid nothing for it except for Lowry's men, whom he didn't mind losing. Derek sat down on the cot. Tallis placed the board on his knees and got down to business. He said that yesterday Derek had distributed about 800 cans worth of weapons and equipment to the town at the old exchange rate. He said he'd given it away for free. He asked what would happen tomorrow when everyone in Talbot realized that weapons were now worthless. Derek didn't understand right away. Tallis explained slowly. He said that in the new world, it isn't hunger that keeps people in line. It's need that controls people. He said that need is the only force that makes 200 people obey 80. He said that in a single day, Derek had eliminated the need for weapons throughout the entire territory of Talbot. He said that the day after tomorrow, he would have 200 armed men who would want nothing from him. He asked how Derek planned to run a city like that. Derek was silent for a long time. Then he answered, and that answer determined everything that followed. He said there was no need to run a city like that. He said you had to trade with a city like that. He said that a man with an automatic rifle needs ammunition every week. He said that a man with a generator needs fuel every day. He said that need hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply shifted to a higher level. Tallis looked at him, and his expression gradually changed. He set the board down on the floor and said that in 23 years of supplying the city, this was the first time he'd heard this idea from someone 20 years his junior. He said he'd think about it. He left, and Derek was left alone. Tarn Wexler was reading Beck Lowry's report for the third time and couldn't find a single error in it. He was sitting in the office of a former oil refinery in a settlement called Skepka. From the window, he could see the flare on the stack. The flare had been burning for 11 months without interruption and was visible 20 miles away. Wexler was 52. He had worked at this facility for 29 years, and on the day of the collapse, he turned out to be the only person within a 100-mile radius who knew how to keep the plant from shutting down. That's what made him who he became. He never killed for power. He simply controlled the only diesel fuel valve in the West and doled out rations. Rusty Hod consisted of 9 settlements and 400 barrels, and they all depended on that tap. Wexler understood his system down to the last screw. That's exactly why he understood what had happened in Talbot. He called Lowry and asked him 4 questions. How many rounds had the defenders fired? Lowry replied that it was about 2,000. How many defenders were there? Lowry replied that there were about 200. Wexler did the math in his head and said that worked out to 10 magazines per person per day. He said that no town east of the river had such reserves. He said he didn't have such reserves either. He asked the 4th question slowly. He asked if they had ever run out of ammunition, even once during the entire battle. Lowry replied that they hadn't. Wexler placed the report on the table and remained silent for a long time. Then he said aloud something that no one in this world had ever articulated before him. He said that after the collapse, exactly 3 forces remained on Earth. The first are those who control a resource that cannot be replenished. Warehouses, pharmacies, arsenals. They are rich today and dead in a year. He called them rotten kings. The second are those who control a resource that can be replenished. Water, fuel, salt. There are few of them. They hold everyone else in check. He said he belonged to the second group. The third power consists of those who know how to produce from scratch. He said there wasn't a single one left on the continent. All the factories had shut down within the first month. He said that all global power for the past 11 months had rested on one simple fact. No one is doing anything. Everyone is just dividing things up. And now a fourth type has emerged, one that wasn't in his scheme. A man who creates something out of nothing. Wexler told Lowry that such a man must not be killed. He said that killing him would be the same as blowing up the only well. He said that such a man must be taken in. He ordered the western route to be blocked off and no fighting to take place. He said that hunger would do the job better than 240 guns. He was wrong about one thing. He thought Talbot was starving. At that time, Talbot was undergoing a complete overhaul of its way of life. Derek did what he'd been putting off for 3 weeks. He introduced a currency system. Before that, the city had been using an informal banking system, and the exchange rate fluctuated twice a day. Derek gathered all the merchants in the square and announced a standard unit. He called it the norm. 1 ration is 1 can of meat, 400 grams, and 1.5 liters of water. That's what a person eats and drinks in a day to be able to work. He said that everything in Talbot is now measured in rations. A box of ammunition is 3 rations. A day's work for an adult man is 2 rations. A doctor's appointment is 4. A liter of diesel fuel is 9. He said that he himself set the exchange rate and that it never changed. Irma Guest listened to this while standing at her desk with a notebook in her hands. For 11 months, she had been Talbot's sole bank. She kept track of all the debts, took her tithe, and believed she would outlast any government because governments change, but the notebook remains. She listened until the end and said loudly that things didn't work that way. She said that prices couldn't stay the same. She said that prices rise when there's a shortage of goods and fall when there's an abundance, and that it had always been that way, and that the boy had taken it upon himself to play God. Derek replied with a single sentence. He said that prices stay the same as long as the goods don't run out. Irma opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. She stared at him for a long time. Then she did something no one expected of her. She walked over to the table, opened the notebook to the first page, and placed it in front of Derek. She said the notebook listed 460 debts over 11 months. She said half the debtors had died. She said that if the quota really hadn't changed, her notebook had become worthless yesterday. She sat down on her stool and cried for the first time in a year. Then she wiped her face and said she wanted to keep track of the quotas. Derek hired her on the spot. What followed was a period of growth that people later referred to in various ways. 4 snapshots remain from those 3 weeks. The first, the 18th day. Odin Brass opens a second workshop and switches from repairs to manufacturing. He builds stoves from sheets of steel and sells them for 9 norms each. In 1 week, he installs stoves in 41 homes. For the first time in a year, no one in Talbot froze. Second, day 22. A reception desk opens in the square. Anyone can bring an item and sell it to the city for norms, not for the warehouse, for contribution. Derek buys up everything that's unique: a sewing needle, a bearing, a glass jar with a lid, a thermometer. Every purchase is a new item and a fresh start from scratch. Crane keeps a record of the purchases, and in 3 weeks, the town brings in 309 unique items. Third, the 26th day. The first caravan of outsiders arrives from the south. 4 people and a wagon. They've traveled 90 miles because they heard about a town where the exchange rate is fixed. They leave a day later with a full wagon and a piece of paper on which the exchange rate is written. A week later, 3 caravans arrive. 2 weeks later, 11. Fourth, day 31. Dana Fisk trains the first 100 members of the town militia. They all have identical body armor, identical assault rifles, and identical magazines. She calls them the Standard 100, and the nickname sticks. Talbot is no longer a city. Talbot has become a marketplace. By the end of the 4th week, more goods were passing through it than through the entire eastern route combined. And then Derek faced a consequence he hadn't foreseen. He hadn't foreseen it because he was a storekeeper, not an economist. The norm had held because he had guaranteed it from the registry. But in 3 weeks, about 600 new people had arrived in the city. Each one needed a daily norm. Crane brought in some boards and drew 2 lines. Production was rising in straight steps along the new lines. Consumption was rising along a curve, and the curve was steeper. Crane said that in 7 weeks they'd hit a wall again. He said that Derek had built a machine that attracted the hungry faster than it could feed them. He said this wasn't a warehouse, it was a funnel. And that very evening, a letter arrived from Arc 4. It was brought by a man who had walked 30 miles around the riverbed. He could barely stand. The letter was written on the back of an old waybill. Travis Shaw's handwriting was as neat as ever. Shaw wrote that the western route had been blocked for 4 days. He wrote that Rusty Hod had cut off his fuel supply and that the Ark's generators would shut down in 9 days. He wrote that without the generators, the cold storage unit would shut down. He wrote that there were 2 metric tons of medical supplies in the cold storage unit, 40 of which Derek hadn't had time to stock. He wrote that once the generators stopped, they would turn into trash within a week. And at the very end, he added a single line without any emphasis. He wrote that if the supplier didn't come for the remaining items by the 9th day, they would be lost forever, and there was no other warehouse like this one on the continent. Derek read the letter twice and placed it on Crane's board. He worked on it for 4 minutes and realized the problem had no solution. It was 19 miles to the Ark via the western route. The route was held by Lowry's men who had dug in. The detour along the riverbed was 34 miles, and a truck couldn't make it there. It would take 4 days to walk there and back. 40 types of medication meant 40 items that he could never replace with anything else. He told Crane he would go. Crane replied that it was suicide. Mira Colt said she would go with him. Dana Fisk said she would provide 20 men from the 100-man contingent. And then Wayne Tallis said he wouldn't let him go. He said it, for the first time ever, without mincing words. He said that Talbot's supplier was no longer a private individual. He said that 800 people in 2 settlements in 11 caravan routes depended on Derek Vale. He said that no commandant in the world would let such an asset go down the river for 4 days. He said the matter was closed. Derek looked at him and asked about Tessa. Tallis replied that the girl was well and that she would return home when things calmed down. Derek thought it over again and realized that things would never be quiet, and that Tallis understood that too. He agreed out loud. He said he was staying. That night, he left. Mira Colt Nix and 6 members of the Norm 100 went with him. Dana Fisk left her post for 2 hours and then went to Tallis herself to report what had happened. She said she'd done it deliberately and was ready to face the consequences. Tallis didn't do anything to her. He just stared at the map for a very long time. The journey along the riverbed took 2 days. 3 sections remained. The first night. Nix walks 40 paces ahead, reading the tracks by the light of a lantern tucked under his jacket. He finds a detour around the Rusty Ride Junction and leads the group across the scree. He does it silently and skillfully, and Mira Colt calls him by his name for the first time instead of Kid. Second, noon on the 2nd day. They lie in a gully for 6 hours while a patrol truck drives along the ridge. No one speaks. Derek lies on his back, mentally flipping through the register and counting kickbacks to keep his mind off his sister. Third, night of the second day. They emerge at the northern perimeter of the Ark and see only 2 figures on the watchtowers instead of 4. They're conserving fuel. No lights are on anywhere. Travis Shaw has aged 5 years in 3 weeks. He met them at the gate himself and said nothing. He simply opened the refrigerated compartment. It had been cold inside just a day ago. Now, it was cool. Derek had been working 26 hours straight. He brought in everything he could manage. 40 items turned into 71 because he was picking up things he'd missed before. Blood substitutes, anesthetics, insulin, vaccines in vials of 10 doses each. On the 72nd item, blood started streaming from his nose, and Shaw forcibly took the box from him. Shaw said that a dead supplier was worse than lost medical supplies. He said he saw a man who had been clinging to sheer stubbornness for a month. He said no one lives that long. And at that moment, large-caliber fire erupted on the eastern perimeter. Tarn Wexler arrived at Ark 4 behind the warehouse. He had come for Derek. The deserters reported to him that the supplier had left Talbot and headed north, and Wexler understood exactly what was happening. He sent 200 men and 7 vehicles equipped with machine guns to the warehouse and ordered them to take only 1 man alive. Shaw's garrison had 54 weapons and enough fuel for 2 hours of searchlight operation. The battle raged all night. Derek did the only thing he knew how to do. He sat down on the concrete in the hallway of the main building and began handing out supplies. A magazine took 22 minutes. A box of ammunition took 4 hours. A bulletproof vest took 40 minutes. By 4 in the morning, he had issued 109 magazines, and that held the perimeter. By 5, he had issued 140, and the perimeter was starting to crumble anyway. Endless ammunition doesn't help against machine guns mounted on vehicles. They needed grenades. There was no grenade entry in the registry. Travis Shaw came to see him at 6 o'clock. He was wounded in the shoulder and was holding his arm against his chest. He sat down next to him on the concrete and said he'd been wrong that night at the armory. He said that 23 years in supply had taught him to prioritize security, and that until the very end, he'd protected the warehouse from people instead of protecting people with the warehouse. He took a key out of his pocket and handed it over. He said everything had to be accounted for. He said he understood now. He said that a rotten king is the one who guards the stockpile, not the one who puts it into circulation. He stood up and walked toward the east gate to organize the retreat. He never made it. He was cut down by a burst of fire on the parade ground, 15 paces from the steps. Derek saw it from the doorway. He couldn't bring himself to go out. Miracolt grabbed him by the collar and dragged him back into the corridor. They withdrew at 7 in the morning through the northern breach. Of the 54-man garrison, 19 made it out. Of the 6 fighters from the normal squad, 2 made it out. Nix took a bullet in the thigh and was carried on a poncho for 8 miles. Miracolt covered the retreat from the water intake pump and was the last to leave, her rifle empty. Ark 4 fell 2 hours after they left. Tarn Wexler entered the area and took whatever was left there. He got a warehouse he didn't need, and he didn't get the one thing he'd come for. The return trip took 3 days. Derek walked ahead and didn't speak to anyone. He leafed through the register. 549 entries. Everything that had been in the warehouse now existed only in his mind. He thought about how Travis Shaw had handed over the key to the armory 9 minutes before his death, and how that key now opened nothing. They arrived in Talbot on the evening of the 4th day. The town was intact. Lights were on in the square. The boilers in the reception desk were operating. There were 6 caravans parked there. Nothing had changed. Derek walked across the square past his men, and they parted to let him through, remaining silent. He reached the former bank and pushed open the door. Wayne Tallis was sitting by the window. He wasn't warming his hands on a mug. There was no mug. He looked up, and Derek saw on his face the very same expression he'd seen on Irma Guest's face as she looked down at her notebook. Tallis said he was glad the supplier had returned alive. Then he told the rest. He said that 4 days ago, a negotiator from Tarn Wexler had come to see him. He said that Wexler had proposed a deal. The Rusty Path would never touch Talbot or the Crest. The Rusty Path would supply diesel at 9 norms per liter indefinitely. In exchange, the Crest would hand over a supplier to Wexler. One person. Tallis said he had refused. Derek waited for more, and he got it. Tallis said he had refused 4 days ago. He said that in those 4 days, Arc 4 had fallen, and that now Talbot had neither a warehouse, nor a second source, nor any fuel. He said that this morning a council of 9 people had gathered on the Crest, and that the council had voted 8-1. He said he was the one. Derek asked about his sister. Tallis replied very quietly. He said the girl had been taken away from the Crest at noon today. He said he hadn't given the order. He said it didn't change anything. Derek didn't lunge at Tallis or run out into the street. He sat down in the second chair in the former bank and asked for a chalkboard. Mira Colt stood in the doorway with her hand on her gun, not understanding what was happening. Crane brought the chalkboard. Derek picked up the chalk and wrote a single line. 9 norms per liter. He stared at it for a minute. Then he asked Tallis how much diesel fuel Rusty Ride dispensed to the outside world per day. Tallis replied that it was about 4,000 liters for 9 settlements and everyone who came through. Derek wrote a second line. 4,000. He asked how many barrels Wexler had. 400. He asked how many of those 400 were stationed at the coupling itself, by the unit. Tallis said about 60. The rest were scattered across the 9 settlements and along the highway. Derek wrote the third line. 60 and 340. And then he said something that made Crane drop his chalk. He said that Wexler wasn't the boss of 400 people. He said that Wexler was the boss of the line. He explained it slowly, just as he had explained it in the square. He said that the 340 people of the Rusty March served Wexler neither out of loyalty nor out of fear. They served him because without diesel fuel, their settlements would grind to a halt within a week. Pumps, generators, trucks, mills. He said that if these 9 settlements found another source of fuel, Wexler would be left with 60 men and a pipe with a flare. Mira Colt asked where they would find another source. Derek looked at her and replied that the source would come from him. He leafed through the register aloud. Entry 109. A 20-liter canister of diesel fuel. He'd placed it on Arc 4 on the first night, between the generator and the ammunition box, and hadn't touched it since because there was enough fuel in Talbot. The burn time for it was 3 hours and 40 minutes. 8 canisters a day, 160 liters. Compared to Wexler's 4,000, it was a drop in the bucket. Crane said this out loud. He said the math didn't add up, and that 160 liters wouldn't bring anything down. Derek replied that there was no need to bring anything down. He said he wasn't going to flood 9 towns with diesel. He was going to do something else. He was going to set the price. He wrote the 4th line on the board. 4 ration coupons per liter. He said that tomorrow Talbot would announce an indefinite price for diesel fuel that was half that of Rusty Ride. He said they would dispense 10 liters per person and no more than 8 canisters per day. He said that would be just enough for everyone in the 9 settlements to learn the price. Tallis stood up from his chair. He'd worked in supply for 23 years and figured it out before anyone else. He said this would bankrupt Wexler in a month without a single shot being fired. He said no one would pay 9 when they could get 4 right next door. He said that all of Wexler's power rested on the fact that there was no alternative, and that an alternative didn't necessarily have to be plentiful. It's enough for it to exist. Then came 17 days that were later called the solar winter. 4 snapshots remain from that time. The first, day 2. On 8 Pillar Square, a separate table is set up with a tin sign. 4 rations per liter, indefinitely. There's no line at the table. No one believes it. By evening, a man from the village of Krivaya Balka arrives and buys 10 liters. He carries them away in a bag as if they were stolen. Second, day 6. 40 people are standing at the table. 29 of them are from the West. Irma Guest keeps a list and writes down where each person is from. By evening, she brings Derek the notebook and tells him that customers are coming from 6 out of 9 villages. Third, day 9. For the first time in 11 months, the daily quota isn't met at Shepka. Tarn Wexler lowers the price to 7 units. 2 days later, to 5. 4 days later, to 3.5. He does what any monopolist would do, and it's his undoing. He lowers the price below the cost of production and starts burning through his reserves to keep the line moving. Fourth, day 14. The first settlement leaves Rusty Run. It isn't fighting. It simply stops sending people to the highway and gets fuel from Talbot. 2 more follow suit. Wexler's 340 barrels begin to dwindle, not from losses, but from accounting. By the 17th day, Talbot had distributed 2,700 liters of diesel fuel. Rusty Pass had lost 4 settlements, 190 people, and its entire fuel reserve, which it had been stockpiling for a year. Beck Lowry dismantled the trenches on the western route on the 12th day himself. He had nothing left to refuel the vehicles with.
All this time, Derek hadn't slept more than 5 hours a day. He was recording, dispensing, and counting. He never once asked about Tessa out loud. He asked Crane once, and Crane replied that the girl had been taken west and that the trail went cold after that. Derek nodded and went back to the board. Mira Colt told him on the 4th day that he was acting like a machine. He answered her with a single sentence. He said that if he started to feel, he'd stop counting. He said he could count faster than anyone in this town and that it was the only weapon he had. She didn't ask any more questions. On the 18th day, a negotiator arrived from Scepter. 1 man and 1 car, unescorted. He brought a letter and stood in the square while Derek read it. Tarn Wexler wrote briefly and without any dignity. He wrote that he acknowledged defeat. He wrote that he was offering an alliance on whatever terms Talbot might name. He wrote that he was ready to place the oil refinery complex under joint administration. And at the end, he wrote the most important part. He wrote that he had the girl, that she was alive and well, and that he would return her unconditionally along with the people who had brought her. He wrote that he had no intention of bargaining with the child because he had already realized who he was dealing with. Derek read the letter standing in the middle of the square, and he was shaking so hard that Crane had to support him by the elbow. 2 days later, Tessa Vale returned to Talbot. She had lost weight and remained silent for the first day, never letting go of the copper cartridge case on a string clenched in her fist. That very one. Derek didn't ask her any questions. He sat next to her on the mattress, listening to her breathe. And for the first time in 5 weeks, he wasn't counting anything. Tarn Wexler arrived on his own on the 4th day. He turned out to be a short, weary man in a clean shirt. He walked into the former bank and, first thing, placed his calculations for the past 11 months on the table in front of Derek. All fuel invoices. He said he didn't understand how he'd lost a war to a man who'd never fired a shot at him. Derek replied that he hadn't been at war. He said he'd simply quoted a different price. Wexler sat down in a chair and said that now he understood why, in 11 months, no one had rebuilt a single factory. He said that everyone had been busy dividing up the spoils. He said it was the first time he'd met a man who calculated turnover rather than a share. He asked permission to remain as manager of the hub. Derek agreed. Something clicked in his mind. The agreement was signed that very evening. Talbot, Combe, Rusty Pass, 21 settlements, about 4,000 people, a single standard, a single exchange rate, a single supplier. Crane hung a map on the wall of the former bank and marked the border on it. It turned out to be the size of the former region. Derek stood in front of that map and realized that in 5 weeks, he had gone from being a man with a single can to a man who held 4,000 lives in his hands. He felt nothing resembling triumph. He felt the weight of it all. That night, Nix woke him up. The boy was still walking with a cane and had dragged into the house a man they'd picked up off the Western Highway. The man wasn't from Rusty Pass or from the caravans. He was wearing a military-style jacket without a single stain, exactly the same one Derek had seen on the commandant's assistant in Graben a month ago. Only the insignia on it were different. The man didn't resist. He asked to be taken to the supplier himself. He said he needed Derek Vale in person. He placed a folded sheet of thick white paper with genuine letterpress printing on the table and spoke 11 words. Derek took the sheet and read it twice. The paper was printed. In this new world, that meant more than any stamp. Printing requires electricity, a press, ink, and paper. All of this together meant that somewhere, it wasn't just a warehouse or a generator that was operating. Somewhere, a production facility was up and running. The text was terse and brief. The Continental Reconstruction Commission notified that the production facility designated Vale was being transferred to the Commission's control under emergency protocol. A deadline for reporting was specified, 21 days. A location was specified, Marrow Junction, 140 miles to the southeast. The consequences of failure to appear were specified. The consequences were summed up in a single word: confiscation. The man's name was Ansel Kidd. He was about 40. He was not a military man. He was one of those who, before the collapse, carried a briefcase and knew the regulations by heart. He sat very upright in a chair in the former bank and spoke in an even tone. He said that the commission had been in existence for 14 months. He said that it was composed of the remnants of 3 federal agencies and relied on 2 surviving military units. He said that under its control were 41 settlements, 11,000 people, and 3 functioning production facilities. He named them: a brick factory, a hydroelectric power plant on a small river, repair shops with a printing press. He said this was the only real government authority on the continent. Crane asked him about food. Ansel Kidd answered honestly. He said that the commission was feeding 11,000 people using 3 army supply depots and that the depots would run out in 7 months. He said that all the calculations had already been made and that everyone in the administration knew the date. He said that was precisely why he was there. Derek asked why the commission would nationalize a person when it could simply offer a deal. Kidd looked at him with confusion. He said that a resource of that magnitude could not belong to a private individual. He didn't say it as a threat. He said it as a matter of fact. He had worked for 20 years in a system where everything belonged to the system and couldn't think any other way. He left that morning. He left a sheet of paper on the table and said he'd return in 21 days with an escort. He said he hoped for a voluntary surrender. He said he didn't want to enforce protocol. What followed were 3 weeks that the Union later referred to as the Big Count. Derek gathered everyone he considered a leader at the former bank: Tallis, Crane, Wexler, Dana Fisk, Mira Colt, Irma Guest, Hart Mulder. He placed the note on the table and said there was nowhere to run and that he wouldn't fight 11,000 of them. He said he would take stock. First, he demanded the figures. Crane laid out the ledgers for the past 5 weeks. Wexler laid out the fuel invoices. Irma Guest brought the ration notebook.
By evening, a picture was hanging on the wall that no one had ever seen in its entirety before. The union was feeding 4,200 people. Derek's production yielded the equivalent of 3,900 rations per day. The shortfall of 300 quotas was covered by having some people eat every other day. There was no reserve at all. Derek stared at those numbers for a very long time. Then he said something that made Tallis sit down. He said that the commission was right. He said that one person should not be the sole source of food for 4,000. He said that if a stray bullet killed him tomorrow, cannibalism would begin in 9 days. He said he hadn't built an economy, he'd built a prosthesis. Crane objected that a prosthesis was better than a stump. Derek replied that a prosthesis couldn't be passed down as an inheritance. For the next 3 weeks, he did not do what was expected of him. 4 snapshots remain from those weeks. The first, day 3. Derek gathers 9 people in Odin Brass's workshop and lays out copies of tools before them. Turning tools, drills, taps, hammers, an endless supply of everything. He says that from this day forward, the city will learn to make things with its own hands. Odin Brass laughs and asks why if they can just copy things. Derek answers with a single sentence. He says that a copy dies with him. Second, day 8. An arithmetic class opens in the former school. Irma Guest teaches 40 people how to keep track of income and expenses. Not to read, don't write, just keep track. She says there are about 10 literate people, but not a single one who can count. 2 weeks later, she has 112 students and a waiting list. Third, day 12. Wexler launches a second line at the junction in Skepka. Not using copies, using real oil from an old well 6 miles away. The output is 40 times less than before the war. Wexler stands over the first barrel of real diesel fuel and remains silent for 4 minutes. Then he says that this is the first liter produced by people, not a miracle. Fourth, day 17. Dana Fisk allocates 100 rounds to single-shot rifles of her own design, made in Brass's workshops. The automatic rifles remain in reserve. She explains the reason bluntly. She says that a soldier accustomed to an endless supply of ammunition will die in the very first battle where the ammunition runs out. She says she's training them for a future without Derek. He doesn't argue. By the end of the 3rd week, the Alliance was producing about 200 rounds per day with their own hands. Compared to 3,900 copies, it was a drop in the bucket. But Crane drew 2 lines on the board and pointed out the key difference. The copies were growing in steps and hitting a plateau. Their own production was growing slowly and wasn't hitting any plateau. He said the intersection point would be in 11 years. Derek looked at it and said that 11 years was perfect. He said it was the first time he'd seen a line that went up without him. 4 days before the deadline, it wasn't Ansel Kidd who arrived. A convoy of 9 cars with an emblem on the doors arrived. It was the same quadrilateral as on the pillars of the Ark of 4, only with a different number. Leading the group was a man named Moret Wygand, a colonel. He was 50 and spoke even less than Tallis. He didn't go into the former bank. He set up a table in the square and summoned Derek Vale to the table. He said 3 things. First, the commission is canceling the 21-day deadline and demands immediate appearance. Second, the reason is that the commission ran its calculations based on Kidd's report and arrived at a figure. He placed a sheet of paper on the table. On the sheet was a calculation of Derek's daily productivity against the standard norms. The figure was accurate to the nearest 20. Derek looked at it and realized that Ansel Kidd hadn't just gone on a reconnaissance mission. He had counted everything he saw. The third point was the most important. Wygand said that the commission would begin starving not in 7 months, but in 3. One of the 3 storage facilities had been broken into and looted by their own people. He said that 11,000 people would die before the year was out. He said he'd been ordered to deliver the resources at any cost and that he would carry out that order. He said that last part very quietly. He said he had 200 men in his column and that a battalion was 6 hours' march away. Derek counted exactly 30 seconds. He saw 2 options and both were bad. Fighting meant burying 4,000 for the sake of principle. Going meant sacrificing 4,000 for the sake of 11,000. And then he chose a third option. He asked Wygand one thing. He asked if the convoy was carrying empty trucks. Wygand replied that it was, 8 empty ones out of 9. Derek nodded. He said he would go voluntarily and unescorted. He said he would leave tomorrow. And he said the trucks would leave here full. He turned to Crane and ordered him to start loading. Overnight, the Union handed over 9,000 rations to the Commission, everything in reserve and everything they'd managed to gather in 12 hours. Tallis tried to stop him, but Derek wouldn't listen. He said just one thing, that it's harder to kill someone you've already shared with. In the morning, he said goodbye to his sister. Tessa didn't cry. She said she would go with him. He said no. She pulled a copper shell casing on a string from under her shirt, pressed it into his palm, and clasped his fingers with hers. She said that now he had to return it in person. He said he would. He got into the lead vehicle next to Colonel Vagon, and the convoy headed southeast. Once they were outside the city limits, Derek looked back once. In 8 Pillars Square, lights powered by a generator were burning, boilers were running, and a reception table stood there with a tin sign. 4 rations per liter, indefinitely. The journey to the Marrow Junction station took 2 days. Derek rode in the lead vehicle, looking out the window and counting. He counted the poles bearing the emblem. He counted the checkpoints. He counted the people at the checkpoints and the weapons in their hands. By the end of the first day, he had realized the most important thing about the commission. It was real. The roads had been cleared. The bridges had been reinforced. Signposts indicating distances stood at the intersections. Every 20 miles, there was a locked water tap with a guard post next to it. All of this had required a tremendous amount of effort and meant that someone was thinking not just about tomorrow, but 5 years down the road. Derek hadn't seen anything like it in 14 months. Marrow turned out to be not a station, but a town. 8,000 people. A functioning hydroelectric plant on the dam. Streets lit for 3 hours a day. A school. A 200-bed hospital. And hanging over it all was a certain atmosphere that Derek picked up on within the first 15 minutes. Everyone ate sparingly. People on the streets moved slowly. Children didn't run around. He could tell that at a glance. He wasn't put in a cell. He was given a room with a window and a bed, and 2 guards were posted at the door. He asked if they were security or an escort. They didn't answer. In the morning, he was summoned to see the chairwoman. Irma Vale Crest had headed the commission for 14 months. She was in her late 50s. Before the collapse, she had been the Deputy Minister of Emergency Management, and within the first week, she found herself the highest-ranking official among all the survivors within a 300-mile radius. She received Derek in her office, which featured a map covering an entire wall. There were flags on the map. 41. She didn't start with threats or formalities. She placed his own calculations on the table and asked where he'd gotten the method. Derek said he'd been a storekeeper for 12 years. She nodded as if that confirmed it. Then she spoke plainly. She said the commission was dying. She said the 3 storage facilities were all it had left, and that one was lost and the other 2 would be empty by spring. She said that in 14 months, the commission hadn't been able to launch a single food production facility. They'd managed bricks, they'd managed electricity, they'd managed paper, but not food. She said the soil was dead, that greens hadn't sprouted for 14 months, and that no one understood why. Then she asked the question she'd called him in for. She asked how many rations per day he could provide. Derek answered honestly, 3,900. She did the math on a piece of paper right in front of him and looked up. She said that wouldn't be enough for 11,000 people. She said that at full capacity, he would cover 1/3 of the commission's needs and none of his own union's needs. She said he'd have to choose who to feed. Derek replied that he wouldn't choose. She asked why. He replied that the question was framed incorrectly. He said she was treating him as a source of food. He said he wasn't a source of food. He was a source of samples. And that's when he explained what he'd realized back in Talbot, but hadn't said out loud to anyone. He said that making a copy costs him the same amount of energy whether he's copying a can of stew or a machine. He said that copying food was the most foolish use of his gift that he'd come up with in 5 weeks because he'd been a hungry storekeeper and had been thinking with his stomach. He said that food shouldn't be copied. Food should be grown. What should be copied is what allows you to grow it. He asked to be shown the fields. Irma Veilcrest looked at him for a long time. Then she led him to the southern plots herself. Their conversation in the field lasted 4 hours. From it, Derek remembered 3 things. First, an agronomist named Delph Sorrow showed him soil samples. The soil was not contaminated. The soil was cold and lifeless in appearance. Ash in the atmosphere blocked 2/3 of the sun's light. Seedlings would sprout and die by the 4th week. Second, Sorrow said that greenhouses would solve the problem, but there were no greenhouses. No glass, no plastic sheeting, no frames, no fuel for heating, no pipes, no pumps, no decent seeds. He listed these things wearily, like a man who'd listed them 100 times already. Third, Derek listened to the list, and a table opened up in his mind of its own accord.
Every item on Sorrow's list was a thing. Every thing was copied. He asked the agronomist one thing. He asked if he had at least one sample of each. Not 100, just one. Sorrow replied that he did. He said he had one of everything needed lying in his shed, and that he'd been looking at that shed for 14 months and wanted to hang himself. Derek asked to be taken there. It took him 4 hours to carry everything in. A roll of plastic sheeting, a 3-meter steel pipe, a pump, a thermometer, a grow light, a ballast for the grow light, a cable, a bag of tomato seeds, a bag of potato seeds, a box of potting mix. He listed 41 items and called out the processing times allowed. Plastic wrap, 40 minutes. Pipe, 25. The pump, 2 hours. The lamp, 48 minutes. Seeds, 18 minutes per bag. Delph Sorrow listened to these figures and calculated them in his head, and Derek saw his hands trembling. Then the agronomist said one sentence. He said that the first greenhouse, covering 400 square meters, would be up in 11 days. He said that for 14 months he'd considered himself a useless person. He sat right down on the ground by the shed and cried openly. Irma Veilcrest stood nearby and said nothing. Then she said what Derek had been leading up to throughout the entire conversation. She said she was revoking the seizure order. She said she was offering a contract. Derek replied that he agreed, and something clicked in his mind. The registry's capacity had been expanded. It took them 2 days to draft the agreement. Irma Veilcrest turned out to be just as much of a stickler for numbers as Crane. She scrutinized every line. The final result was as follows. The Commission recognizes the Union of 21 settlements as an autonomous territory with its own government. Derek Vale remains a private citizen and is never subject to seizure. In exchange, he transfers to the Commission copies of all equipment listed under agriculture and medicine without restrictions. The norm is recognized as the single unit of account throughout the Commission's territory. The exchange rate is fixed indefinitely. Derek read the final draft and added a single line by hand. He wrote that anyone possessing a sample of an item may submit it to a supplier and receive 100 copies in exchange, free of charge. Valecrest asked why. He replied that otherwise, within a year, he would know everything that existed on the continent, and that would be more dangerous than any army. He said he wanted people to bring him things themselves and of their own free will. She looked at him over the paper and said that in 14 months, this was the first time she had seen a person who limited his own power on his own initiative. She signed it. Derek lived in Marrow for 19 days. He logged 12 hours a day. He entered 1,200 entries. 3 snapshots remain from those days. First, day 6. The first plastic-covered greenhouse, 400 square units. Inside, 12 supplemental lamps from the hydroponic station are lit. Delph Sorrow walks among the garden beds and feels the soil with his hands. Second, day 11. Derek enters a printing press from the print shop into the registry. It takes 19 hours. Valecrest asks why he needs the press. He replies that every settlement needs record forms. She laughs for the first time since they met. Third, day 16. A 4-page letter from Crane arrives from Talbot. The union's own production has risen to 340 units per day. Irma Guest's arithmetic class has graduated its first 30 students. Nix walks without a cane and leads caravans. At the very end of the letter is a 4-word postscript from Tessa. She writes that she's waiting and counting the days. On the 19th day, everything fell apart. Derek woke up to the sound of running in the hallway. He went out and saw Colonel Wygand without his jacket and holding a pistol. Wygand told him to go back to his room. Derek didn't go. By 4 in the morning, he knew everything. That night, at the northern warehouse in Marrow, the last fully stocked storage facility had been broken into, from the inside. 18 members of the warehouse security team loaded up 6 trucks and headed north. They weren't pursued because there was no way to chase them. The Commission lost 70% of its remaining food supply in a single night. Irma Valecrest convened a council meeting at 6 in the morning. Derek stood against the wall and listened. The tally was brief. 8,000 people in Marrow and 3,000 in the outposts. The remaining supplies would last 9 days. Sorrow's greenhouses would yield their first harvest in 41 days. The shortfall was 32 days. 32,000 person days. Then one of the council members stood up and stated the obvious. He said that there was a man in their city who produced 3,900 rations per day. He said that in 32 days, that person would close the gap entirely. He said that only one thing was needed to achieve this, to halt all deliveries to the Union of 21 settlements for those 32 days. He said that 4,000 people in the East would have to endure it. He said they were used to going hungry. Derek asked to speak. Irma Valecrest gave him permission. He walked over to the map and asked for some chalk. He wrote the number 32,000 on the wall and circled it. Then he wrote a second number next to it, 4,200. He said the first number represented the number of man-days of the gap. He said the second number represented the people they were proposing to remove from the ration list. He asked the council how many days the Union could hold out without supplies. No one answered. He answered himself. He said 9 days, relying on its own production and remaining stockpiles.
He said that on the 10th day, the same thing that happened last night at the northern warehouse would begin. He said that people aren't starving out of respect for the calculations. People are breaking into the warehouses. He said that in 12 days, the Commission in the East would face not autonomy, but 4,000 armed, starving people with endless ammunition. He put down the chalk. He said he was proposing another solution. He said he would give the Commission full production for 32 days, but not at the union's expense. He said he would close the gap another way. He asked for 3 days to work it out. They gave him 2. He didn't sleep for 2 days. He sat in a room with a window and leafed through the register. 1,740 positions. He wasn't looking for food. He was looking for speed. And on the second day, he found it. The solution lay in the very first mistake he'd made back in Talbot. He'd been calculating the drawdown 1 position at a time and adding them up sequentially. He was closing 1 position every 5 minutes because he was standing there waiting. But the rollbacks ran in parallel. All 1,740 positions ticked simultaneously and independently. He had never checked the limit simply because he'd never had that many positions at once. He checked that very night. He launched 212 food positions simultaneously. Rations in olive green packaging, canned meat, crackers, grains in bags, condensed milk, biscuits, each with its own processing time ranging from 8 minutes to an hour.
He sat down on the floor and began counting the output per hour. An hour later, there were 406 food units lying on the floor. Not 3,900 daily rations, 9,700. He looked at this mountain and realized that they had starved for 14 months of peace, partly because the former storekeeper had counted sequentially instead of in parallel. He reported this to the council that morning and made no attempt to hide the reason. He said outright that he had been mistaken for 5 weeks. Irma Vale-Crest listened and said that in 14 months, this was the first time she'd heard someone admit their own stupidity at a council meeting. She said that was worth more than any calculation. Then came 32 days, which in Marrow were simply called a month. 4 segments remain of them. The first, day 4. There are 20 tables in the courtyard of the hydroelectric plant. A person sits at each one, receiving the rations. Derek walks in a circle among the tables, places his palm on an empty spot, and an item appears there. He completes a circle in 11 minutes. He makes 80 circles a day. Irma Guest would have been delighted by such an accounting. Second, day 9. Derek collapses at the 3rd table. Silas Wren would have come and said the same thing he said in Talbot. Hospital Dr. Marrow puts it in his own words. He says that a person expends his own energy on a copy and that the supplier's stock is not infinite, unlike the registries. Derek is put on bed rest for a day. He gets up after 11 hours. Third, day 18. The first sprouts in Sorrow's greenhouse rise to the height of a palm. The agronomist brings Derek a single tomato leaf in a tin box, a real green leaf. Derek holds it in his hands longer than he held the first can. Day 4, day 27. A caravan from Crane arrives from the east. The Union has sent 400 rations of its own production to Marrow, not copies, their own. Crane sent a 1-line note. He wrote that the production line had gone up without him. By the 32nd day, the gap had been closed. The Commission hadn't lost a single person to starvation. Sorrow's greenhouses yielded their first harvest 9 days ahead of schedule. Irma Vale-Crest convened a council meeting and announced that the territory was switching to a mixed supply system, copies and local production. She announced the breakdown. Copies, 60%, local production, 40%. She said that in 2 years, she wanted the ratio reversed. Derek started getting ready to go home. He didn't leave. 3 days before his departure, a report came in from the north.
The 18 men who had hijacked the trucks hadn't disappeared. They had reached a former regional center called Sfold and found something there that no one had expected. They found a surviving arsenal belonging to the internal troops. Not a food warehouse, an arsenal specifically. Heavy weaponry, armored vehicles, 12 operational units. Over the course of a month, about 900 people had gathered around this arsenal. They were commanded by the former head of security at the Northern Storage Facility, a man named Derek Holt. Derek noticed the coincidence of the names, and he didn't like it. Holt sent out the same letter to all the settlements. He wrote that the commission and its supplier were deceiving the people. He wrote that a man named Vale could produce endlessly and that the commission was deliberately stifling distribution to keep everyone on rations. He wrote that true freedom is when everyone takes as much as they want. He wrote that he was going to liberate the source. And the most dangerous part was that he was telling half the truth. Derek really could produce more. He couldn't produce infinitely. The difference between more and infinitely was the very difference that almost no one in the New World understood. Irma Veilcrest set the report on the table and said that over the past 14 months she had feared many things, but she had never feared abundance. She said that Holt would gather 3,000 people in a month simply by promising, "Take as much as you want." She asked Derek what to do. Derek replied that they couldn't go to war with him. He said that any war would prove Holt right. He said that if the commission sent soldiers to defend the supplier, everyone would see exactly what was described in the letter. He said the response had to be different. He asked for paper and a printing press, which he brought in himself. He wrote a one-page text. He didn't argue with Holt or accuse him. He simply printed the numbers. He printed the number of entries in the registry. He printed the kickback for each of the first 40. He printed the daily output. He printed how many people consume it. He printed the difference. He printed a single sentence at the end. He wrote that endless is not the same as fast, and that anyone who wished to could come and count for themselves. He signed his name and title, Supplier. 11,000 copies were printed in 6 days. They were distributed to 41 settlements along all the caravan routes and throughout the Union. It was the first printed publication on the continent in 14 months. 2 weeks later, the results came in. They were not what Veilcrest had expected. Holt's people did not scatter. Their numbers grew. 900 became 1,400. But Holt began to face other problems. Delegations from the 4 settlements he had occupied came to him with that very paper and demanded an explanation for the numbers. He couldn't provide one. He declared the paper a forgery by the commission. They didn't believe him, precisely in the places where they had previously read the leaflet carefully. Derek Holt realized he was losing ground and did the only thing he knew how to do. He moved out ahead of schedule. He sent 12 armored vehicles and 1,400 men south. Not toward Marrow, he headed east. Colonel Wygand spread out a map, pointed out the route, and said the objective was obvious. Holt was heading for the alliance of 21 settlements. He was heading for Talbot. Derek looked at the map and did the math. It was 210 miles from Svad to Talbot. A column of armored vehicles covered 40 miles a day, 5.5 days. It was 140 miles from Marrow to Talbot. By car on cleared roads, that would take a day and a half. He had a 4-day head start and not a single soldier. Colonel Wygand offered 3 companies. Derek refused. He explained why, and everyone in the office understood immediately. He said that if the commission sent troops into the Union would cease to be autonomous that very day, and Holt would be proven right in hindsight. He said that Talbot should defend Talbot. Miranda Veilcrest asked how she could help. Derek asked for one thing. He asked for a printing press, paper, and permission to print whatever he deemed necessary without approval. She granted it. He left 2 hours later with 4 people. He carried with him a roster of 1,800 entries and not a single fighter. He entered Talbot at the end of the second day. The city had changed for the third time. A real wall stood there, concrete blocks twice a man's height, a gate, 4 watchtowers. In the square, 6 boilers were operating, along with 3 reception desks and a counting class in the former school. The population had grown to 6,000. Talbot had ceased to be a city and had become the capital. Tessa was the first to run out to him. She had grown in those 2 months and was now half a head taller. She didn't say a word about having waited for him. She simply thrust a copper casing on a string into his hand and said that now he wouldn't be going anywhere. He didn't make any promises. The council convened an hour later. Tallis, Crane, Wexler, Dana Fisk, Mira Colt, Irma Guest, Garth Mulder, Odin Brass. Nick sat on the edge and took notes. He was 15 and had been leading caravans for 6 weeks. Derek laid out Holt's map and figures. 1,400 people, 12 armored vehicles, 3-day deadline. Dana Fisk reported her figures. The quota had risen from 100 to 400 men, plus a 600-strong militia. That made a total of 1,000 guns against 1,400 men and armored vehicles. She said the line could be held. She said it was impossible to hold it against armored vehicles. Tallis said aloud what everyone was thinking. He said that Talbot had nothing to counter 12 armored vehicles with guns. He said that an endless supply of ammunition was useless against armor. And then Garth Mulder raised his hand and said something that silenced the room. He said that if they didn't have weapons against armor, then there shouldn't be any armor. He said that the armored vehicles ran on diesel fuel. Wexler looked up. He said that 12 units consumed about 800 liters a day. He said that Holt couldn't take enough fuel with him to last more than 5 days. He said that at that pace, Holt's fuel would run out right as he approached his target. Crane was already writing on the board. He wrote down a number and circled it. He said that Holt was counting on refueling in the Union. He said that Holt's entire logistics plan was based on him taking fuel from whoever he was heading toward. Derek looked at the board and said that, in that case, the matter wouldn't be settled by battle. He ordered Wexler to remove or destroy all fuel within a 40-mile radius of the route within 2 days. Every last canister. Wexler asked about his settlements. Derek said the settlements could go a week without gas stations. He said it was cheaper than a funeral. Then came 2 days of preparation. 4 cuts remained from them. The first. Wexler drives around 9 settlements in 30 hours and transports 14,000 liters to Skepka under guard. Whatever doesn't fit, he dumps into an old well. He stands over the drain and says he prayed for 11 months for every liter. Second, Dana Fisk takes 100 men off the wall and leads them to the flanks. She explains that the wall is holding back the infantry, and her men must target the wheels and fuel tanks. She hands out 2 body armor vests per person, 1 to wear, 1 to carry as a spare. Third, Odin Brass makes 600 bottles of incendiary mixture from kerosene and glass bottles in 2 days. He laughs as he works for the 3rd time in his life. Fourth, Derek prints the second leaflet. He prints 8,000 copies a day. The leaflet doesn't mention Holt at all. It sets out the union's policy, the standard rate, what it includes, and how much a day's work is worth, how much a cartridge costs, how much diesel costs, and 1 line at the end. It states that anyone arriving in Talbot receives a daily wage for their work, and that they are not required to surrender their weapons. Mira Colt distributes these leaflets from 2 trucks along the entire route of Holt's convoy, 1 day before they arrive. The convoy approached Talbot on the morning of the 5th day and came to a halt 3 miles away. It arrived with empty fuel tanks. Of the 12 armored vehicles, 8 made it under their own power. 4 broke down on the road. Derek Holt was no fool. He grasped the situation within an hour. He lined up his men and announced an assault for the following morning. He said there was enough fuel in the city to last a year and that everyone would be able to refuel once it was taken. He repeated his promise that they could take as much as they wanted. And then something began that neither Derek nor Dana Fisk nor anyone on the council had planned for. That night, 11 people came from Holt's camp to Talbot. They brought a leaflet. They said they wanted to verify the line about the daily work quota. They were fed and put to work sorting through the rubble. In the morning, 60 arrived. By noon, 340. No one fired a shot. People simply walked across the killing field in small groups and sat down by the cauldrons. Dana Fisk later said that the hardest part that day was keeping her men from firing. She walked along the wall and repeated a single order: do not shoot at those walking unarmed. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Holt realized he was losing his army. He did the only thing he could. He sent 8 armored vehicles into the attack with whatever fuel they had left and the men who were still with him. There were about 600 of them. The battle lasted 2 hours. 8 vehicles reached the wall, and 3 of them broke through the gate. They were set ablaze, with bottles of Odin brass right in the breach, and the passage was blocked with burning metal. The remaining 5 came to a halt, out of fuel, 200 paces from the wall. The crews got out and raised their hands. The infantry fell back. Talbot lost 19 men that day. Among them was Odin Brass. He was setting the 3rd vehicle on fire in the breach and didn't have time to get away. Derek Holt was brought in that evening. His own men brought him in. He stood in the square of the 8 pillars before a crowd of 6,000, and Derek walked out to him, unarmed. Holt told him to his face that he had lied. He said that a man producing 9,000 units a day had no right to give people just one. Derek answered him in front of everyone, and it was the shortest reply he'd ever given. He said he gave one because there were 4,000 people. He said that if he gave out 5, there wouldn't be a single one left in 8 days. He said that infinite referred to time, not quantity, and that Holt still hadn't understood that. The crowd fell silent. Holt was silent too. He was at a loss for words. Derek ordered him to be released. He said that the man who had killed 19 people in Talbot would have to live with that himself. He said that executing him would mean turning him into the truth. Holt left for the north with 14 people, and they were never heard from again. Odin Brass was buried the next morning. The whole town attended the funeral. Derek stood by the grave, holding a hammer from the workshop in his hand. A real one, not a replica. He entered it into the registry that same evening and named the item after the craftsman. That night, Crane came to him with some boards. He said he'd crunched the numbers. He said that in one night and one day, 900 people from Holt's column had joined the Union. He said the Union's population had surpassed 7,000. He said that at the current rate of production, they'd be back on track. Not in 7 weeks, in 4 months. He placed the board on the table and said the most important thing. He said it would always be this way. He said that every time Derek won, people came to him, and every time he got closer to the edge. He asked how Derek planned to end this. Derek stared at the board for a very long time. Then he replied that he knew how. Derek asked Crane for 4 days and saw no one. He sat in a former bank with some boards and did his calculations. On the 4th day, he went out to the square and asked that everyone in the Union who kept even the simplest of accounts be gathered there. 212 people came. 112 of them were graduates of Irma Guest's accounting class. He spoke for 40 minutes. He began by stating the key figure for the entire 15 months. He said that during that time, he had produced about 400,000 units of goods. He said that during the same period, the Union had produced about 11,000 with its own hands. He said that the first figure would die with him on the day he was killed by a stray bullet or a common illness. The second figure
would never die. He said that for 15 months, everyone had considered him a miracle. He said that a miracle was the most dangerous kind of supply because it had no duplicate. And he announced the decision he had prepared over the course of 4 days. He said he was phasing out food rations, not immediately, according to a 2-year schedule. Each month, food rations from the registry would be reduced by 4%, 24 months until they reached 0. He said that in exchange, starting tomorrow, he would open up free distribution of everything the union produced: tools, machinery, pumps, plastic sheeting, lamps, cable, seeds, pipes, stoves, free of charge and in any quantity, except for weapons. He said that every settlement in the union would receive a kit for a greenhouse and a workshop within 3 months. He said that anyone who didn't start working now would be starving in 2 years. He said this bluntly and without mincing words. The crowd was silent for a long time. Then everyone spoke at once. The first to speak out against it was a man from a distant village. He said this was a death sentence for the elderly and the sick. Derek agreed with him aloud. He said that for the elderly, the sick, and children, the supply would remain fully available indefinitely. He said the cuts applied only to those who were able to work. Irma Guest jotted this down on a separate line. The second to speak was a woman from the line, Esther Wimes. Esther herself was no longer with them. She had died in December in her own bed at the age of 82, and the whole town had mourned her. The woman said she remembered when water was first rationed at 5 liters per can. She asked why they were breaking what was working. Derek answered her with 4 figures. He cited the union's membership a year ago, 200 people. He cited today's figure, 7,100. He cited production output. He cited the tipping point. He said that what works is already broken and that it's only visible on the board. They argued for 4 hours. They voted in the dark, powered by a generator. The resolution passed by a vote of 171 to 41. 24 months followed. 4 snapshots remain from that time. The first, the 5th month. In Talbot, there are 9 greenhouses with a total area of 3,500 square units. The first potato harvest. Not a copy, their own. Derek stands at the edge of the field, holding a tuber in his hands, and realizes that for the first time in a year and a half, he's holding food he didn't produce himself. Second, the 11th month. Dana Fisk hands over command of the 100 per man quota to the man she trained herself and leaves for Marrow as an instructor. Before leaving, she tells Derek that there isn't a single fighter left in her unit who's used to having an endless supply of ammunition. Third, the 16th month. The first true full-cycle workshop is operating in the Union. It manufactures pumps from its own metal by hand, based on the designs that Derek had copied by the hundreds. The workshop bears the name of Odin Brass. Fourth, the 21st month. Nix returns from an expedition to the southwest with a map of 41 new settlements. He is 18. He brings back 9 samples of items not listed in the registry and receives 100 copies of each, per the rules stipulated in the contract. 2 years later, food distribution from the registry ceased. There was no famine. In the final month, its share amounted to 6% of total consumption. Almost no one noticed this transition. That was exactly how Derek had planned it. He remained a supplier, only now he wasn't supplying food. He was supplying everything used to make food. The Commission and the Union continued to exist side by side for a long time. The Norma became the single unit of account across the territory from Marrow to Rusty Pass. Irma Vale Crest died in the 5th year, and her place was taken by a man elected by a vote of 41 settlements. The first election in the New World was held using ballots printed on a machine Derek had replicated. Wayne Tallis remained the commandant of the ridge.
He and Derek never became friends. They respected each other, and both knew why. Tallis once told him that in his entire life, he had met only 2 people who understood logistics, and that the second of them was 20 years younger, a fact that still stung him to this day. Crane kept the Union's general records until his retirement and compiled the continent's first statistical compendium. It was 4 fingers thick and consisted entirely of tables. He considered it the best book in the world. Irma Guest graduated 1,400 students from her arithmetic class over the course of 9 years. Mira Colt led caravans for another 3 years before heading south and sending letters every 6 months. Garth Mulder served in the highway patrol until the very end. Tarn Wexler restored the second well. Tessa Vale trained under Silas Wren and became a doctor. She took over his clinic when the old man went completely blind. She wore a copper cartridge on a string her whole life and never explained to anyone why. Derek Vale lived a long life. He never held any position other than the one specified in his contract: supplier. He didn't build himself a house better than anyone else's, nor did he hire security. People came to him with samples right up until last year. He would bring in and hand out 100 copies and keep track of everything by hand. By the end, the registry contained about 11,000 entries. He never found out where his gift came from and stopped thinking about it around the 3rd year. He thought about other things. He thought about how the gift had come to him at the very moment he had made an honest deal and had grown with each subsequent one, and how it didn't work with anything taken by force. He thought that this was not a random rule, but a condition of the problem. He had been solving it incorrectly for 15 months and correctly for 2 years. In his 9th year, he traveled to Talbot for the opening of the second school. The road passed by 8 pillars square. The pillars were still standing in their place. The tin signs with the exchange rates had long since been removed, and signs with street names had been hung in their place. By the 3rd pillar, the bouncer Cordo had once stood and poured half a bottle of water onto the ground in front of a man who had nothing to give his sister to drink. Cordo died on the wall during the assault on Holt. He had been in the 100 of the norm for 3 years, and he was buried with honors. Derek stopped by that pillar. He stood there for half a minute. Then he walked on. At school, they showed him his new class, 30 children. On the blackboard was a chart he'd devised during his first week. Intake, output, balance. The children were calculating in norms. One norm was a 400-gram can of meat and 1.5 liters of water, what a person eats in a day to be able to work. The ration had remained unchanged for 9 years. The teacher asked him to say something to the children. He thought for a moment and said one sentence. He said that nothing lasts forever and that the only things that endure are the things someone does every day. Then he went out onto the street. It was overcast, as always. The ash was slowly clearing from the atmosphere, and doctors said it would take another 30 years for complete purification. But the sky that day was lighter than usual. On the southern slope, beyond the wall, stood greenhouses. There were about 400 of them. Lamps were glowing under the plastic sheeting, and inside it was green. Derek Vale looked at that green light and went home to do his math.